I live in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where people mow their lawns at exactly 8 a.m. on Saturdays and bake casseroles for every minor inconvenience. My house sits on a cul-de-sac, and for as long as I've lived here, the house at the end of the street has been empty. At least, I thought it was. A month ago, I saw someone moving in, a man, tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. He didn't wave or smile, didn't introduce himself like most people do. He just carried box after box into the house, his movements mechanical, his face blank. That night, I noticed his lights were off. No glow from the windows, no sign of life. Just darkness. The next day, I decided to be neighborly. I baked some cookies, store-bought dough, but it's the thought that counts, and walked over to introduce myself. The first weird thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me as soon as I stepped onto his porch, a sharp, acrid scent, like burnt plastic mixed with something sweet. I hesitated, one hand raised to knock, when I heard something on the other side of the door. Scratching. It wasn't frantic, more like deliberate dragging, as if someone, or something, was tracing slow circles against the wood. I knocked anyway. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. After a long moment, the door creaked open just a crack, revealing the man's face. He didn't look at me. His eyes were focused somewhere over my shoulder, wide and glassy, like he was staring at something I couldn't see. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "I live down the street. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." I held out the plate of cookies, but he didn't take them. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just stood there, motionless, his breath shallow and uneven. Okay, well, I placed the plate on a small table near the door. "If you need anything, I'm just a few houses down." He closed the door without a word. That night, I woke up to the sound of something clattering in my backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, heart pounding. When I reached the back door, I peeked through the curtains and froze. The man was standing in my yard, barefoot, staring up at my bedroom window. I shouted at him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly to the side, his arms hanging limp at his sides. By the time I worked up the courage to open the door, he was gone. The next day, I called the police. I didn't know what to tell them. My neighbor's creepy, and he was in my yard last night? They sent someone out to talk to him, but when the officer came back, he just shrugged, said he doesn't know you, hasn't left the house since he moved in. Probably just a misunderstanding. I didn't believe him. Over the next few nights, the noises started. Soft at first, scraping sounds coming from the direction of his house, faint tapping on the walls of my bedroom. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe raccoons, but then I started seeing things. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, too tall and too thin to be human. Flickers of pale, distorted faces in the dark windows of his house. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I was sure I'd closed it before bed. That was when I decided to install cameras. I set them up around my house, pointing toward his property, and checked the footage every morning. For the first few days, there was nothing, just the usual rustling of trees and the occasional stray cat. But on the fourth night, I saw him. The man was standing at the edge of my yard, just beyond the reach of the floodlights. His face was turned toward the camera, but it didn't look like a face anymore. His features were blurred, almost melting, his eyes too large and too bright. And behind him, something moved. It was hard to make out, tall, spindly shapes that seemed to shift and ripple like heat waves. They surrounded him, their forms blending into the darkness, their movements slow and deliberate. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, the battery dead despite being fine the day before. When I went back inside, I found a note on my kitchen table. It wasn't written in pen or pencil. The letters were carved into the wood, deep and jagged, as if by a claw. "He doesn't live here. Neither do you." I don't know how it got there. That night, the noises grew louder. Scratching, tapping, the sound of heavy footsteps pacing just outside my window. When I finally worked up the courage to look, I saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, pale and elongated, with empty eyes and gaping mouths, surrounding my house. The man was among them, his face still melting, his body twisting in impossible ways. They didn't try to get in. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I'm writing this from the attic, the only place in the house where I feel remotely safe. The noises haven't stopped, and the figures are closer now. I don't think they're going to wait much longer. I work as a night janitor. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I don't mind the quiet. Most of the time, it's just me, my mop, and the hum of fluorescent lights. I've cleaned schools, office buildings, even hospitals. But nothing prepared me for the old courthouse on Market Street. It was one of those buildings you'd swear was haunted just by looking at it. Built in the 1800s, with towering columns, cracked stone steps, and windows that reflected the world in warped, unsettling ways. The place had been abandoned for years, deemed structurally unsound. But the city decided to restore it and turn it into a museum. That's where I came in. The construction crew was long gone by the time I started my shifts, leaving behind a half-finished interior that felt more like a tomb than a workplace. My job was simple: clean up the layers of dust, sweep the halls, and make sure the workers didn't leave tools or debris lying around. The first few nights were uneventful. Sure, the building creaked and groaned like it had a life of its own, but old buildings do that. I kept my headphones on, drowned out the eerie ambience with music, and got the job done. Then came Thursday. It started small. I was mopping the main corridor, an endless stretch of marble that gleamed under the dim overhead lights, when I noticed something strange. My reflection in the polished floor wasn't right. It moved when I moved, sure, but there was a lag. A fraction of a second where it didn't quite sync up. I stopped, staring down at myself, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head, but the unease stayed with me. Later that night, I was emptying the trash bins in the old courtroom when I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it, but it was there. A voice, low and hushed, coming from somewhere near the judge's bench. I froze, my hands gripping the trash bag. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. No response. I walked toward the bench, my footsteps loud against the wooden floor. The whispering stopped as I approached, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The air felt heavier, colder, and for a moment, I had the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone. I left the courtroom and didn't go back that night. The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. Ghost stories were for kids, not grown adults with bills to pay. When I arrived, the building was colder than usual. My breath fogged in the air as I walked through the main hall, the sound of my keys jangling unnaturally loud. The whispers were back, faint and intermittent, like they were coming from the walls themselves. Then, as I was sweeping one of the upstairs corridors, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the end of the hall. "Hey!" I shouted, spinning around. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of shadows and the faint outline of a door at the far end. I should have walked away. I should have turned around, clocked out, and left. But something compelled me to move toward that door. It was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I noticed a faint light spilling out from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped into what looked like an old storage room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with crumbling ledgers and dusty boxes. In the center of the room stood a table, and on the table was a single object, a gavel. The gavel looked pristine, almost new, gleaming under the soft light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as my fingers brushed the wood, the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers exploded into a cacophony. Voices, dozens of them, all overlapping, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The air grew icy, and the light flickered, casting the room in strobe-like flashes. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of ledgers, my heart pounding in my chest. The gavel moved. I swear to God, it moved on its own, sliding across the table like an invisible hand had pushed it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. And then I heard it, a single, clear voice, low and commanding, coming from right behind me, "Guilty." I spun around, but there was no one there. The door was open again, the hallway beyond empty and still. I didn't wait. I ran, leaving my cleaning supplies behind, and didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. I quit the next morning. A few weeks later, I heard that the restoration project had been halted. One of the construction workers had fallen from the second floor under mysterious circumstances. He'd survived but refused to talk about what happened. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the courthouse, about the whispers, the gavel, and that single, terrifying word. I've read up on the building since then, about the trials that used to take place there, about the lives that were ruined within those walls. And I can't help but wonder, if I'd stayed just a little longer, would that voice have said my name? I'd never heard of Morrow House until I inherited it. The letter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, informing me that an uncle I'd never met, a man named Arthur Morrow, had passed away and left me his house. It came as a surprise, not just because I didn't know Arthur, but because as far as I knew, my family didn't have anyone wealthy enough to own a sprawling Victorian estate. The letter included a key and an address. It was in a town I'd never heard of, about 3 hours' drive from where I lived. My first instinct was to sell the place and be done with it, but curiosity got the better of me. Who was Arthur Morrow, and why had he left his house to me? I decided to visit the next weekend. The house was a monstrosity. It loomed at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown trees and wild, unkempt grass. The paint was peeling, and the shutters hung at odd angles, but the structure itself was still intact, a hulking, foreboding silhouette against the gray sky. The air felt strange as I approached, heavy and thick, like it was charged with static. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the musty scent of an abandoned building, but something sharper, like burnt wood and damp earth. The interior was dark, even though it was midday. Dust motes floated in the faint light streaming through cracked windows. The foyer was massive, with a sweeping staircase that led to the second floor. The walls were lined with faded portraits, stern faces staring down at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The furniture was still there, as if Arthur had simply walked out one day and never returned. A coat hung on the rack near the door, and an ancient clock on the mantel ticked softly, though I couldn't see any way it was being powered. I wandered through the house, each room revealing more oddities. A library filled with books in languages I couldn't read. A music room with a piano whose keys were smeared with something dark. A dining room where the long table was still set with silverware, tarnished and untouched. But it wasn't until I reached the study that I found the journal. It was lying on the desk, its leather cover cracked and worn. Unlike the rest of the house, the journal looked recently used. I opened it, and the first entry stopped me cold. To whoever finds this, the house is not empty. It never has been. The handwriting was neat but hurried, like the writer had been racing against time. The entry went on. Morrow House is a place of thin veils. The walls here are porous. They let things through. I've spent my life trying to understand it, to contain it, but I fear I've failed. If you're reading this, leave. Lock the door behind you and never come back. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept reading. The entries grew more frantic as they went on, detailing strange phenomena. Voices coming from rooms that should have been empty, shadows moving against the grain of the light, and a faint, rhythmic tapping that started in the walls and grew louder each night. Arthur described hearing whispers in the middle of the night, faint at first, but eventually loud enough to wake him. He wrote of seeing shapes in the mirrors that didn't match his reflection. And then there was the door. He didn't specify where it was, only that it shouldn't be opened. "The door isn't meant for us," he wrote. "It's a mistake, a wound in the fabric of things. I tried to close it, but it won't stay shut." The journal ended abruptly, the final entry a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's awake." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the air pressing in on me. The house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping, coming from somewhere upstairs. I froze, straining to listen. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and never come back. But something about the sound pulled at me, like a hook lodged in my chest. Against my better judgment, I found myself climbing the stairs. The tapping led me to a door at the end of the hallway. It was smaller than the others, its surface scarred and weathered. The handle was tarnished brass, cool to the touch. I knew this had to be the door, the one Arthur had written about, the one that wasn't meant for us. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the handle. The house was silent now, the air so thick it felt like I was breathing underwater. And then the whispering began. It wasn't coming from behind the door. It was everywhere, surrounding me, slipping into my ears like oil. The words were unintelligible, but they carried a weight, a malevolence that made my head ache and my vision blur. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the whispers urging me on. But I turned the handle. The door swung open, revealing a darkness so deep it felt alive. The air on the other side was colder, sharper, carrying a faint metallic tang. For a moment, I saw nothing, and then something moved. It was quick, almost too fast to register. A shape, vast and impossible, shifting in the darkness. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glimmered faintly, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. And then it saw me. The whispers exploded into a deafening roar, and I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. The handle burned hot against my palm, and I let go, falling to the floor. The house trembled. The walls seemed to pulse, the air filled with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was outside, the fresh air hitting me like a slap. I didn't go back. I didn't lock the door, either. I just drove away, leaving Morrow House and whatever was inside it far behind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping on my bedroom walls. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. And I wonder if I really left it behind, or if it followed me. The first time I saw the staircase, it was raining. I'd been walking home from work, the streets slick with water and reflecting the pale glow of streetlights. I took a shortcut through a side alley I'd passed 100 times but never entered. It seemed ordinary enough, graffiti-tagged walls, the faint smell of wet asphalt, until I noticed it. At the far end of the alley, where it should have opened back onto the street, there was a staircase. It wasn't there before. It wasn't just the suddenness of its appearance that unsettled me. It was how wrong it looked. The steps were made of pale, unpolished stone, the kind you'd expect to see in an ancient ruin, not the middle of a city. The staircase was narrow and spiraled upward into the darkness, vanishing into the misty night sky. There was no building for it to lead to, no logical explanation for it to exist. I stood there, rain dripping from my hood, staring at the steps. Something about them pulled at me, like a whisper just out of earshot. I felt an irrational urge to climb them, but I didn't. I walked away quickly, refusing to look back until I reached the safety of my apartment. I told myself it was nothing, a strange art installation, maybe, or some new architectural project. But that night, I dreamed about the staircase. In the dream, I was standing at the base, my hand on the cold stone railing. I looked up, but the top was shrouded in darkness, unreachable. When I woke up, my feet ached, as though I'd been walking for miles. The staircase didn't leave my mind. Days passed, and I found myself avoiding the alley, taking longer routes home just to steer clear of it. But the dreams kept coming. Each night, they grew more vivid. I'd climb higher and higher, the stone steps cold and rough beneath my bare feet. There was always a faint hum in the air, like the sound of a far-off wind or distant voices. One night, I woke up with dirt under my fingernails and the distinct smell of rain in my room. The next day, I went back. The alley was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. And there it was, the staircase, exactly as I remembered it, impossibly out of place. I don't know why I started climbing. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air grew thicker the higher I went. The city noise faded behind me, replaced by an eerie stillness. The light seemed to change, too. It wasn't quite night or day, just a dim, gray twilight that felt like it belonged to another world. When I looked down, the ground was gone. The alley, the street, the city. Everything below me had dissolved into an endless fog. The only thing that existed was the staircase and the space around it. I kept climbing. After what felt like hours, I saw something ahead, a door. It was carved into the air itself, floating at the top of the stairs with no frame to hold it. The wood was dark and ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the iron handle, but then I heard it, a faint knock, as if something on the other side was waiting for me. When I opened the door, the world beyond it was wrong. It was a house, or something pretending to be one. The walls were too tall, the windows too narrow, their glass smeared with something dark. The floor was covered in thick, wet moss, and the air smelled of decay. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. There was a hallway stretching ahead, lined with doors on either side. The first door I opened led to a room that looked like my childhood bedroom, except the colors were off, like they'd been drained of life. The bed was unmade, the posters on the walls tattered, and on the desk there was a photo of me, but I was older, my face gaunt and unfamiliar. The next room was worse. It was a mirror image of my apartment. Every detail was perfect, the worn couch, the half-full coffee cup on the table, except for one thing. Someone was sitting in the armchair, their back to me. "Hello?" I whispered. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" As I reached out, the figure stood, turning just enough for me to see the edge of their face. It was me, or something that looked like me. Its eyes were hollow, its smile too wide. Before I could scream, it stepped forward, forcing me out of the room. The door slammed shut, and when I turned, the hallway was no longer empty. The doors had all opened, and shadows spilled out of each one, stretching across the walls and floor. They moved like liquid, their shapes twisting into jagged, impossible forms. The air filled with a low, guttural sound, like laughter warped through static. I ran. The hallway twisted and stretched, bending in ways that defied logic. The shadows followed, their movements jerky and unnatural. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the door at the end of the hall, it wasn't the same one I'd entered. This one was smaller, its wood splintered and charred. I yanked it open and stepped through, and I was back in the alley. The staircase was gone. The rain had stopped, and the city buzzed around me as if nothing had happened. But when I looked down, my hands were covered in moss, and my shoes were soaked with mud. I haven't been able to find the alley since. It's as though it never existed. But at night, I still hear the knock. I was filling out a form online, a boring task, something about renewing my driver's license. When I reached the field for my name, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a long moment, I couldn't remember it. I stared at the blinking cursor, my mind scrambling to fill the void. It wasn't a total blank. Fragments of syllables swirled at the edge of my thoughts, none of them connecting. And then, almost automatically, I typed, Helen Ward. I'm not Helen Ward. I don't even know anyone named Helen Ward. But the name felt right as soon as I saw it on the screen, like a familiar melody I couldn't place. I closed my laptop and went to bed early that night, chalking it up to exhaustion. But the next day, things were worse. At the coffee shop, the barista called out, "Helen, your latte?" I froze. The name was mine. I knew it wasn't, but it felt like it was. Even my coworkers started calling me Helen. "Morning, Helen," my boss said as I walked in. "Who's Helen?" I asked, laughing nervously. She gave me a strange look. Are you okay?" The laughter caught in my throat. "My name's not Helen." She frowned. "Is this a joke?" I checked my ID, my emails, my work badge. Every single one bore the same name, Helen Ward. By the time I got home that evening, I felt like a stranger in my own life. My credit cards, my mail, even my passport. All of them said Helen Ward. My photo was the same. My address was correct, but my name was gone. I tried to call my mom. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Something really weird is happening." "Oh, honey, what's wrong?" she asked, her tone warm and familiar. I took a deep breath. "Everyone's been calling me Helen." There was a long pause on the other end. "Because that's your name," she said. I dropped the phone. That night, I tore through every box, every drawer, every dusty corner of my apartment, searching for proof, something with my real name on it. But everything I found bore the same 2 words, Helen Ward. The only thing that didn't fit was an old photograph tucked into a shoebox under my bed. It was a picture of me at the beach with 2 friends from college. Written on the back in faded ink was a simple note, "Best day ever." My real name. I clung to that photo like a lifeline. The dreams started after that. In the first one, I was standing in an empty room. The walls were blank, featureless, stretching endlessly in every direction. A single door stood in the center, and behind it, I could hear faint whispers. When I opened the door, I saw her. Helen Ward. She looked just like me, but her eyes were wrong. Too bright, too sharp. She smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that stretched too wide, like she knew something I didn't. "You're in my spot," she said. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. The next day, the changes began. My apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. The furniture looked the same, but it was all in the wrong place. The couch faced the wrong wall. The coffee table was a different color. My favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip on the rim, was gone, replaced by a pristine, unfamiliar cup. And then there was the mirror. When I looked at my reflection, it looked back, but not quite right. My movements felt a second too slow, my smile unfamiliar. And when I turned away, I thought I saw it keep moving, just for a moment. By the end of the week, my memories were slipping. I couldn't remember the name of my high school. I couldn't remember my first pet. I couldn't remember what my dad's voice sounded like. What I could remember, what I could never forget, was Helen Ward. Her face was everywhere. In the windows of passing cars, in the glass doors of office buildings, even in the puddles on the sidewalk after it rained. She watched me with that too wide smile, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You're in my spot," her voice whispered in my dreams. I started avoiding mirrors, but it didn't matter. She didn't need them to reach me. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She didn't speak this time. She didn't have to. Her smile said everything. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, she was gone. But something was different. I felt heavier, like there was a weight pressing down on my chest. When I looked at my hands, they didn't feel like mine anymore. The last time I saw her was in the reflection of a shop window. I was walking home from work, clutching the old photograph in my jacket pocket. The sun was setting, the streets bathed in golden light. I caught a glimpse of her in the glass, walking beside me. But this time, her smile was different. She looked satisfied. When I got home, the photograph was gone. In its place was a single piece of paper, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "Welcome home, Helen. I don't remember my name anymore. I don't even like radios. My apartment doesn't get great reception, and I've always preferred podcasts or streaming music. But last week, while clearing out my grandmother's attic, I found this old, heavy thing. A clunky wooden radio with polished knobs and a fabric speaker grill. It had that musty attic smell, but something about it was oddly charming. I brought it home, intending to clean it up and maybe sell it as a vintage piece. But when I plugged it in, the thing came to life immediately, crackling and humming like it had been waiting for this moment. The strange part? It tuned itself. I turned the dial, but it didn't matter where I landed. The needle always slid back to one frequency, 88.7. At first, there was nothing but static. Then I heard a voice. "Good evening," it said, calm and measured, like an old-timey radio announcer. "We're so glad you're listening." I leaned in closer, half expecting it to be some kind of quirky public access broadcast. "You've been chosen," the voice continued. "Chosen for what?" I muttered, more to myself than the radio. The static hissed louder, and the voice chuckled. "For the game." The broadcast ended abruptly, replaced by silence. No more static, no voice, no faint traces of music. Just dead air. I turned it off and went to bed, chalking it up to an old radio glitch. The next morning, the radio was on. I hadn't touched it. "Good morning," the same voice said, cheerful and bright. "Today's the day. Are you ready to begin?" "Begin what?" I muttered, staring at the radio. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it gave me an address. 10, Sycamore Lane. Be there at noon. Bring nothing but yourself. And remember, we're always listening. The radio clicked off, leaving me alone in the silence of my apartment. I should have ignored it. I should have unplugged the thing, dumped it back in my grandmother's attic, and pretended I'd never found it. But something about the way the voice spoke made my skin crawl in a way that curiosity overrode fear. At 11:45, I found myself standing outside 10, Sycamore Lane. It was an old, abandoned house. Peeling paint, shattered windows, the whole haunted house aesthetic. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. Inside, the air was damp and cold, despite the heat of the afternoon. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I wandered through the empty halls. In the center of what looked like an old living room, there was a table. On the table was a pair of headphones and a note. The note read, "Put them on. Listen carefully." I hesitated, but the voice from the radio still echoed in my mind. "We're always listening." With trembling hands, I placed the headphones over my ears. Static crackled, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Then the voice returned, softer now, almost soothing. "Congratulations," it said. "You've made it to the first step. Now, let's begin." The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, until it became clear what it was. Knocking. It was coming from upstairs. "You'll need to follow it," the voice instructed. "But be careful. The others don't like to be disturbed." "The others?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. The voice didn't answer. Reluctantly, I climbed the staircase, the knocking growing louder with each step. It led me to a door at the end of the hall, small, unassuming, with the paint peeling around its edges. The knocking stopped as I reached for the handle. Inside was a single chair facing a mirror. On the chair was a cassette tape, labeled with a date. It was today. The mirror wasn't a normal mirror. When I looked into it, my reflection didn't mimic my movements. It stared back at me, smiling faintly. "Sit," the reflection mouthed. I did. The voice in the headphones returned, louder now. "Listen closely," it said, "and don't stop, no matter what you see." The tape clicked on, and a new sound emerged, whispering. Dozens of voices, overlapping, all speaking too fast for me to understand. The mirror fogged over, the edges turning black, and my reflection's smile grew wider. Then it started to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice clear despite the whispers. I tried to take the headphones off, but they wouldn't budge. It felt like they'd fused to my skull, the static drilling into my ears. "You're part of it now," my reflection continued. "It won't let you leave." The whispers in the tape grew louder, forming words I could finally understand. "One stays, one goes." The mirror cracked down the middle, splitting my reflection in half. On one side, it looked like me, terrified, sweating, eyes darting around. On the other, it was something else. Its eyes were pitch black, its smile too wide, its fingers long and clawed. The reflection raised a hand and pointed at me. "Choose," it whispered. I don't know how I got out of that house. I remember running, stumbling through the halls, the whispers chasing me, the sound of laughter echoing through the walls. When I got home, the radio was waiting for me. "Congratulations," the voice said as soon as I walked through the door. "You've passed the first round." I smashed it with a hammer, but it didn't break. It's still sitting on my kitchen counter, humming faintly. And every time I look at a mirror now, I see it watching me, waiting for the next round to begin. I'd always hated that clock. It was a gift from my grandmother, an antique with an ornate brass frame and Roman numerals that looked as if they'd been etched by hand. It ticked so loudly you could hear it from anywhere in the apartment. Tick, 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 steady and unrelenting, like the heartbeat of some ancient creature. One night, I noticed it wasn't ticking. I was on the couch, half asleep with some show playing in the background, when the silence hit me. That constant rhythm I'd tuned out for years was just gone. I sat up, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The room felt unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. I walked over to the clock, expecting to see dead batteries or some mechanical failure. But the hands were still moving. They weren't ticking, though. They were gliding. Smooth and soundless, they slid over the face of the clock like fish through water. And they were moving backward. I reached out, my fingers brushing the brass casing. The moment I touched it, the room spun. Not physically. I wasn't dizzy. But the air around me seemed to ripple, bending like heat waves over asphalt. For a brief second, the walls and furniture around me appeared to shift, their colors and shapes warping into something unrecognizable. When everything settled, the clock was ticking again, perfectly normal. I shook my head, chalking it up to a lack of sleep. But something felt off. The room smelled faintly of burnt wood, and the light from the lamp on my desk seemed dimmer than before. I went to bed, dismissing the whole thing as a weird hallucination. But the next morning, I realized it wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the time on my phone. It was 7:12 a.m. when I woke up, but as I stared at the screen, the time changed, backward. It flickered to 7:11, then 7:10. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and checked again. 7:13 now. Maybe I'd imagined it. I got ready for work, pushing the thought to the back of my mind. But the backwards moments kept happening, little flickers of reality that didn't add up. I'd pour coffee into a mug, only to watch it pour itself back into the pot. I'd grab my keys from the counter, then blink and find them back where I'd left them. And the clock in the living room kept ticking, louder now, the sound echoing through the apartment. By the third day, it wasn't just objects. It was me. I'd be mid-sentence during a conversation, and suddenly I'd be at the start of the sentence again, the words spilling out of my mouth without my control. I'd walk into a room and find myself walking back out of it, as though time had rewound and I was retracing my steps. It wasn't constant. These moments came and went like hiccups in reality, but they were getting worse. The breaking point came on the fifth night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the clock started ticking faster. Tick-tick-tick. It was so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I covered my ears, but it didn't help, and then it stopped. Dead silence. I sat up, my breath hitching, and looked toward the living room. The clock's face was glowing faintly, a soft, pulsating light that spilled across the dark room. Against every instinct, I got out of bed and walked toward it. The hands of the clock were spinning wildly now, forward and backward, faster than they should have been able to move. The glow intensified, and the air in the room grew heavy, charged with an electric hum that made my skin crawl. I reached out to stop the hands, to do something. But the moment my fingers touched the glass, the world shattered. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in a vast, endless field. The ground beneath me smooth and reflective, like a mirror. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds and fractured light, as though the sun and moon were fighting for dominance. And in the center of the field, impossibly tall and ominous, stood the clock. It was massive, its brass casing tarnished and cracked, the hands spinning erratically. Around it, figures moved, shadowy, indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of existence. They seemed to be made of the same fractured light as the sky, their edges blurring and reforming as they circled the clock. One of them stopped and turned toward me. It didn't have a face, just a blank, shimmering surface that reflected the chaos around it. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. It pointed at the clock, its arm elongating unnaturally, and then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound but a sensation, vibrating through my chest and mind at once. "You broke it." "Broke what?" I managed to whisper, my throat dry. "The line." "I don't understand." The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "Time isn't meant to bend, but you touched it, and now it bleeds." The other figures stopped circling and turned toward me. Their movements were jerky, like film skipping frames, and they began to converge, their forms flickering in and out of reality. "What do you want?" I shouted, panic surging through me. Fix it. How? The figure pointed again, this time directly at me. You are the anchor. The knot in the thread. Cut yourself free. I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't get the chance to ask. The ground beneath me began to ripple, and I felt myself being pulled toward the clock. The shadowy figures surged forward, their forms melting and merging until they were a single, massive entity. The clock's hands stopped spinning. They pointed directly at me. Cut the thread, the voice said again, echoing in my skull. Before I could react, the world imploded in a burst of light and sound. I woke up on my couch, gasping for air. The clock was back in its place, silent and still. But its hands were missing, and the face was cracked, the Roman numerals scattered across the glass like broken teeth. The ticking was gone, but so was the time. Every clock, every device, every screen in my apartment, none of them worked. The numbers flickered, shifted, refused to settle. And outside my window, the sun and moon hung in the sky together, frozen in an eternal, fractured twilight. I'm still here, in this liminal space where time has no hold. The figures are watching, waiting, just beyond the glass. And the clock in my living room has started ticking again. The night it started, I had just finished unpacking the last of my things in the new apartment. It was a decent place. 3rd floor, big windows, a little outdated, but nothing I couldn't live with. I was particularly drawn to the view. The apartment overlooked a small park with a pond at its center. The landlord had called it a peaceful neighborhood. I liked that. After a few chaotic years, I needed peaceful. But peace didn't last long. I was settling into bed when I heard the sound. A faint clink-clink, like glass tapping against glass. I froze, listening. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it seemed sharper than it should have been. My first thought was that it was coming from outside, maybe someone walking near the park. But the sound didn't feel distant. It felt inside. I got up, grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron pan from the kitchen, and cautiously checked each room. Nothing. The windows were locked, the doors still bolted. I convinced myself it was just the building settling and went back to bed. The next morning, I found the bottle. It was sitting on the windowsill in the living room, a small glass bottle with a cork stopper. I hadn't noticed it when I moved in, but that wasn't surprising. There was so much clutter to deal with. I probably overlooked it. Inside the bottle was a slip of paper, rolled up tightly like an old message in a bottle. Curious, I uncorked it and unrolled the paper. The writing was tiny, scrawled in pencil, and difficult to read, but I managed to make out the words. Do not look at it too long. That was it. No explanation, no signature. Just a single, cryptic warning. I laughed it off. Probably a prank left by the previous tenant. Still, it gave me a weird feeling. I put the bottle in a drawer and went about my day. That night, the sound came back. Clink, clink, clink. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, every hair on my body standing on end. The noise was coming from the living room. I grabbed the pan again and crept down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. When I turned the corner, I stopped dead. The bottle was back on the windowsill. The drawer I'd locked it in was still shut, the key untouched on my keyring. But the bottle was there, sitting in the exact same spot as before. The paper was inside again, the cork snugly in place. My hand shook as I picked it up and pulled the paper out. The words had changed. You're too late. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the lights on, staring at the bottle, trying to make sense of what was happening. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe the landlord had a spare key and thought this was funny. I called him to ask, but he swore up and down that he had no idea what I was talking about. That evening, I came home to find something new. A second bottle, identical to the first, sitting next to it on the windowsill. This one had a paper inside, too. My hands trembled as I unrolled it. It watches when you sleep. I left the apartment immediately, drove to a friend's place, and told them everything. They tried to reassure me. It's probably just someone messing with you, they said. Maybe you're overreacting, they said. But then my friend offered to spend the night at my place. Strength in numbers, right? I agreed. I wasn't about to go back there alone. We set up camp in the living room. 2 sleeping bags, a couple of beers, the TV playing softly in the background. By midnight, the apartment felt almost normal again. I started to think maybe my friend was right, that I had been overreacting. Then the bottles started shaking. It was subtle at first, barely a vibration, but within seconds, they were rattling violently, clinking against each other like something was trying to escape. My friend jumped up, swearing, and grabbed one of the bottles. "Don't!" I shouted, but it was too late. He uncorked the bottle, and a gust of cold air rushed out, extinguishing the lights and plunging the room into darkness. The TV flickered and died. My friend dropped the bottle with a sharp crash, but instead of shattering, it rolled across the floor, unbroken. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, just a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But it grew louder, sharper, until it sounded like dozens of voices overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. The air grew thick, heavy, and I felt something cold and wrong, brush past me. I grabbed my friend's arm and bolted for the door. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath under the streetlights. Neither of us spoke on the drive to his place. There was nothing to say. We both knew what we'd felt, what we'd heard. The next morning, I called a moving company. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just wanted out. But when I went back to pack my things, the bottles were gone. The windowsill was empty, as if they'd never been there. I moved out that same day. It's been months now, and I haven't been back to Elmwood Drive. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Clink, clink, clink. And last week, when I opened my closet, I found a small glass bottle sitting on the shelf. Inside was a slip of paper with 3 words scrawled in tiny handwriting. "It's not done." A low, steady hum, so faint at first I thought it was in my head. I only noticed it because my apartment was unusually quiet that night. No upstairs neighbor stomping around, no muffled TV from next door. Just silence and that hum. It didn't come from any specific direction. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, even in the air I breathed. I tried ignoring it, thinking it was some distant machinery or maybe tinnitus I'd never noticed before. But the longer I sat there, the harder it was to tune out. It wasn't constant. Every now and then, it wavered, dipping lower like a voice trying to form words. By midnight, it was all I could hear. I turned on the TV to drown it out, but the channels were static, every single one. My phone wouldn't load anything either. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Even the lights in the apartment felt dimmer than usual, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. When I went to bed, the hum followed me. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like pressure in my skull, like someone was pressing cold hands against my temples. I turned off the lights and pulled the covers over my head, but the moment I closed my eyes, I saw something. A shape, dark and indistinct, almost human but stretched wrong, like a reflection in warped glass. It stood just at the edge of my vision, unmoving, its form flickering in and out of focus. My eyes snapped open, and the image was gone. But the hum was louder now, vibrating in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, the hum was gone. Or at least, I thought it was. The apartment was eerily silent again, and the Wi-Fi still didn't work. My phone's clock was frozen at 3:47 a.m. When I opened the curtains, the street outside looked different, familiar, but wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. The colors were muted, the shadows too sharp. People walked by, but they moved strangely, too slow, their heads slightly tilted, their eyes darting around as if searching for something. None of them looked up at my window. I stepped outside to get some air, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the hum returned, faint and pulsing, vibrating in my teeth. I walked to the corner store, hoping to shake off the unease. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, but the store was empty. No cashier, no customers, not even the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The shelves were fully stocked, but every item was blank. White boxes, cans with no labels, rows of water bottles with no logos. I called out, "Hello?" The hum responded, louder now, deeper, like it was coming from the walls. I backed out of the store and hurried home, my heart pounding. The people on the street had stopped walking. They stood perfectly still, their heads tilted toward me, their eyes wide and unblinking. I ran the rest of the way. Inside, the apartment felt colder. The lights were dimmer than before, flickering faintly as I locked the door behind me. My reflection in the hallway mirror didn't look right. Its movements lagged, a split second too slow, and its eyes seemed darker, the pupils too large. I didn't stay to watch it for long. By nightfall, the hum was unbearable. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me from every angle. I tried to block it out with music, headphones, even white noise, but nothing worked. It was inside me, vibrating in my bones. That's when the lights went out. The hum stopped. The apartment was plunged into total silence, total darkness. I sat frozen on the couch, my breath loud in my ears, until I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My muscles were locked, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. And then it spoke. Not words, exactly. It was the hum, but deeper, resonating in my chest. It pulsed once, twice, and I understood. It wasn't a voice. It was a question. Do you see it? The lights flickered back on. The apartment was empty. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone, and the shadows on the walls seemed sharper, more defined. I didn't stay to figure out what had happened. I grabbed my keys and ran. Outside, the city was silent. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. The sky was a flat, featureless gray, and the air felt thick, heavy. I walked for what felt like hours, but every corner I turned led me back to the same place. My apartment. The hum was waiting for me inside. It hasn't stopped since. It follows me everywhere now, growing louder, more insistent. I see shapes in the shadows, figures flickering at the edges of my vision. My reflection doesn't match me anymore. It stares when I look away, moves when I'm still. The hum isn't a sound. It's a door, and something is trying to come through. I'd been at work all day, back-to-back meetings that left my head buzzing and my patience frayed. When I finally got home, I flopped onto the couch and checked my phone, hoping for nothing but silence. Instead, I saw a missed call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something about the timestamp caught my attention. The call had come through at exactly 3:33 p.m., a time that felt too deliberate to be random. Curious, I played the voicemail. At first, all I could hear was static, faint and crackling, like the sound of an old radio struggling to find a station. I was about to delete it when a voice broke through. Hello? It was soft, tentative, like the caller wasn't sure if they'd reached the right number. Can you hear me? The voice asked. It sounded familiar. The message ended abruptly, cutting off mid-breath. I replayed it, trying to place the voice. It wasn't a friend or family member, but there was something about it that stirred a strange sense of déjà vu. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed again. Another call from the same number. This time, I answered. Hello? I said, my voice unsteady. There was a pause, then the same voice from the voicemail. Hello? Is this? The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my pulse racing. Something about the way they'd spoken, the hesitation, the tone, made my stomach twist. I blocked the number, but the calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, they came at random intervals, always from unknown numbers. I didn't answer again, but the voicemails piled up. The messages grew stranger. The first few were just more variations of hello, or can you hear me? But then, they started saying my name. Hello? Are you there? My name, it's me. Whoever it was never identified themselves, and I couldn't place the voice, but they spoke with an odd familiarity, as though they knew me well. Then came the final message. It arrived late one night, waking me from a restless sleep. Groggy, I reached for my phone and played it. The static was louder this time, almost deafening. Beneath it, I could hear faint whispers, too garbled to understand. And then, clear as a bell, the voice said, "You need to leave. They're coming." The line clicked, and the message ended. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up in bed, staring at the phone like it might explain itself, but there was nothing more. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, things got worse. When I left my apartment to grab coffee, I noticed something on the windshield of my car, a piece of paper tucked under the wiper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. Scrawled across the page in jagged, hurried letters were 3 words. "Don't ignore me." I looked around, but the parking lot was empty. By the time I got back to my apartment, the voicemail icon was flashing on my phone again. Another unknown number. Against my better judgment, I played it. "Why won't you listen?" the voice demanded, the static growing louder with each word. "I'm trying to help you. You don't have much time." I deleted the message and threw my phone across the room. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, barely audible, like the wind tapping against the windows. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. I checked the peephole, but no one was there. The knocks came again, this time from the window in my bedroom. I lived on the 3rd floor. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, the blinds trembling as I pulled them back. Nothing, just the empty street below, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lights. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Behind you." I spun around, my breath hitching, but the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The calls kept coming, the texts more frequent. The messages grew darker, more desperate. "You're running out of time. They know where you are. Get out. Now." And then, one day, they stopped. No calls, no texts, no messages. I thought it was over, until I found the photo. It was lying on my kitchen counter one morning, a Polaroid I'd never seen before. The picture was of me, sitting on my couch, staring at my phone. I didn't own a Polaroid camera. On the back, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note on my car, was a single sentence. "You should have listened." I don't know what's happening or who's behind it, but I can feel it now. The weight of someone watching, waiting. And I don't think they're going to stop until they find me. A low, steady hum, so faint at first I thought it was in my head. I only noticed it because my apartment was unusually quiet that night. No upstairs neighbor stomping around, no muffled TV from next door. Just silence and that hum. It didn't come from any specific direction. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, even in the air I breathed. I tried ignoring it, thinking it was some distant machinery or maybe tinnitus I'd never noticed before. But the longer I sat there, the harder it was to tune out. It wasn't constant. Every now and then, it wavered, dipping lower like a voice trying to form words. By midnight, it was all I could hear. I turned on the TV to drown it out, but the channels were static, every single one. My phone wouldn't load anything either. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Even the lights in the apartment felt dimmer than usual, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. When I went to bed, the hum followed me. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like pressure in my skull, like someone was pressing cold hands against my temples. I turned off the lights and pulled the covers over my head, but the moment I closed my eyes, I saw something. A shape, dark and indistinct, almost human but stretched wrong, like a reflection in warped glass. It stood just at the edge of my vision, unmoving, its form flickering in and out of focus. My eyes snapped open, and the image was gone, but the hum was louder now, vibrating in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, the hum was gone, or at least, I thought it was. The apartment was eerily silent again, and the Wi-Fi still didn't work. My phone's clock was frozen at 3:47 a.m. When I opened the curtains, the street outside looked different, familiar, but wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. The colors were muted, the shadows too sharp. People walked by, but they moved strangely, too slow, their heads slightly tilted, their eyes darting around as if searching for something. None of them looked up at my window. I stepped outside to get some air, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the hum returned, faint and pulsing, vibrating in my teeth. I walked to the corner store, hoping to shake off the unease. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, but the store was empty. No cashier, no customers, not even the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The shelves were fully stocked, but every item was blank. White boxes, cans with no labels, rows of water bottles with no logos. I called out, "Hello?" The hum responded, louder now, deeper, like it was coming from the walls. I backed out of the store and hurried home, my heart pounding. The people on the street had stopped walking. They stood perfectly still, their heads tilted toward me, their eyes wide and unblinking. I ran the rest of the way. Inside, the apartment felt colder. The lights were dimmer than before, flickering faintly as I locked the door behind me. My reflection in the hallway mirror didn't look right. Its movements lagged, a split second too slow, and its eyes seemed darker, the pupils too large. I didn't stay to watch it for long. By nightfall, the hum was unbearable. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me from every angle. I tried to block it out with music, headphones, even white noise, but nothing worked. It was inside me, vibrating in my bones. That's when the lights went out. The hum stopped. The apartment was plunged into total silence, total darkness. I sat frozen on the couch, my breath loud in my ears, until I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My muscles were locked, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. And then it spoke. Not words, exactly. It was the hum, but deeper, resonating in my chest. It pulsed once, twice, and I understood. It wasn't a voice. It was a question. Do you see it? The lights flickered back on. The apartment was empty. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone, and the shadows on the walls seemed sharper, more defined. I didn't stay to figure out what had happened. I grabbed my keys and ran. Outside, the city was silent. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. The sky was a flat, featureless gray, and the air felt thick, heavy. I walked for what felt like hours, but every corner I turned led me back to the same place. My apartment. The hum was waiting for me inside. It hasn't stopped since. It follows me everywhere now, growing louder, more insistent. I see shapes in the shadows, figures flickering at the edges of my vision. My reflection doesn't match me anymore. It stares when I look away, moves when I'm still. The hum isn't a sound. It's a door, and something is trying to come through. I bought it at an estate sale, an old, ornate thing with brass accents and a face stained from age. It wasn't expensive, just a curiosity among a sea of vintage knickknacks. I'd always loved things with a sense of history, and the clock had a certain charm. Its ticking was steady and soothing, the kind of sound that could lull you into a trance. The woman running the sale didn't say much about it. "Came with the house," she said with a shrug. "Doesn't work half the time, but it's a beauty, isn't it?" She was wrong, though. It worked perfectly. I set it on the mantel in my living room and wound it that evening, the delicate mechanism clicking softly as the hands spun to life. The rhythmic ticking filled the room, steady and precise. At first, it was nothing but a decoration, a piece of forgotten craftsmanship given new life. But after a few days, the clock started to misbehave. It wasn't the time that was off. It always kept perfect time, to the second. But occasionally, I'd catch the hands moving backward. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they'd tick in reverse before returning to their normal rhythm. I told myself it was a mechanical glitch. Old clocks have quirks. Then came the chimes. The clock wasn't supposed to chime. There was no bell inside, no mechanism for it. But one night, just after midnight, I heard it, a low, resonant note that echoed through the room. I stared at the clock, heart pounding. The hands pointed to 12:03, unmoving. The ticking had stopped entirely. "Just the house settling," I muttered aloud. But the words sounded hollow. The next morning, the clock was ticking again, as if nothing had happened. I almost convinced myself I dreamed it. Almost. A week later, I noticed something strange. The clock would occasionally stop ticking when I was in the room, but only when I looked at it directly. If I averted my eyes, I could hear the soft tick-tick-tick as usual, But the moment I turned my gaze to the face, it would fall silent. That's when I noticed the reflections. The glass face of the clock was slightly convex, creating a distorted reflection of the room behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon I began to see things that weren't there. One evening, as I sat on the couch, I glanced at the clock and froze. In the reflection, there was someone standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My chest tightened as I turned back to the clock. The reflection was normal again. Just the couch, the coffee table, and me. I didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, I moved the clock to the guest bedroom. I didn't want to get rid of it. Something about the thought felt wrong, like it would be a mistake. But I couldn't stand having it in the living room anymore. That night, I heard the chime again. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire house. When I went to check the guest room, the door was ajar. I pushed it open, my stomach twisting. The clock was sitting on the bed, its hands spinning wildly, backward and forward in quick, erratic movements. The reflection in the glass showed the room bathed in red light, shadows twisting and writhing like smoke. "Stop," I whispered, my voice shaking. The hands slowed, the ticking resuming its normal rhythm, and the reflection returned to normal. I didn't touch the clock again after that, but it didn't matter. The chimes came every night, always at 12:03. Sometimes it was a single note. Other times it was a melody, haunting and unfamiliar. The reflections grew worse, showing faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. And then, one night, it showed me. Not my reflection, but me, sitting on the couch, staring at the clock. In the reflection, someone stood behind me, their face obscured by shadow. The figure raised a hand and placed it on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The clock sat silently on the mantel, its face blank and dark. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, the clock was on the floor, shattered. I should have been relieved, but instead, dread crept over me. The clock wasn't supposed to break. It felt indestructible, like something that had been waiting for centuries. Now it was gone, and the house was too quiet. I've started hearing the ticking in other places. My car, the office, even in the silence of my bedroom. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of the reflection. I think the clock was keeping something in, and now, whatever it was, is free. I didn't want to move back home. After 5 years of city life, going back to the tiny town where I grew up felt like failure. But my dad needed help with the family business after his heart attack, and my job prospects weren't exactly booming. So there I was, unpacking boxes in my old bedroom and convincing myself it was temporary. The town hadn't changed much. The same rows of sleepy houses, the same overgrown fields, the same stretches of woods that had always given me the creeps as a kid. One thing had changed, though. The Whistler was back. Growing up, there was this story all the kids used to tell, passed down from older siblings and cousins. It was always the same. Don't go into the woods at night, because if you do, you'll hear the Whistler. And if you hear him, he's already seen you. The Whistler wasn't a person. Not really. No one could agree on what he looked like, or even if he was human. Some said he was a ghost, a man who'd gotten lost in the woods and starved to death. Others said he was a spirit that guarded the trees, punishing anyone who trespassed. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the rule. If you hear him whistling, don't follow it, and don't look for him. Just run. I hadn't thought about the Whistler in years, but the night after I moved back, I overheard my dad talking to a neighbor. "Did you hear about the Thompson's boy?" the neighbor said. "Went missing 2 days ago. Last seen near the edge of the woods." My dad grunted, a non-committal noise, but the neighbor kept going. "That's the third one this year, you know? People are saying, well, you know what they're saying." Later, when I asked him what the neighbor meant, my dad waved me off. "Superstitious nonsense," he muttered, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself the stories from my childhood were just that, stories. But around midnight, I heard it. A whistle. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in the window. But then it grew louder, more distinct. A tune, slow and deliberate, drifting through the air. I froze. My rational brain told me it was just some teenager playing a prank. But there was something about the sound that didn't feel right. It was too perfect, too clear, cutting through the night like it was meant for me. The whistle came again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I got out of bed and crept to the window. The street outside was empty, the houses dark. But beyond the street, at the edge of the woods, something moved. It was hard to see in the dim light, but there was a figure standing just inside the tree line. Tall, thin, with something unnatural about the way it held itself, like its limbs didn't quite work the way they should. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one, but I could feel it watching me. The whistle came again, louder now, piercing the stillness. I stumbled back from the window, my chest tight. Every instinct told me to look again, but I didn't. I closed the curtains and climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets over my head like a scared kid. The whistling continued for what felt like hours before fading away. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, a mind playing tricks. But when I went outside to check the yard, I found footprints. Long, narrow footprints that didn't look like they belonged to any animal I'd ever seen. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At work, in the yard, even inside the house, I felt it. The nights were worse. The whistling came back every night, always starting faint and growing louder, always from the direction of the woods. I didn't tell my dad. What was I supposed to say? That the campfire story he dismissed as a kid was haunting me now? By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed out of the house, determined to prove it was nothing. The air was cool, the night unnervingly quiet as I crossed the yard and approached the woods. "All right," I shouted, shining the flashlight into the trees. "I'm not scared of you. Just stop messing with me." The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the world. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard it. Breathing. It was coming from just ahead, where the beam of the flashlight illuminated the trees. And then I saw it. The figure stepped into the light, its movements jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that stretched too far and a head that tilted unnaturally to the side. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, smooth like polished wood, except for a single hole where its mouth should have been. And from that hole came the whistle, high and clear, filling the night with a melody that didn't belong. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the house. My legs felt like jelly, and my lungs burned. But I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked every window, every door, and sat in the middle of the living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife like it could save me. The whistling didn't come back that night, or the next, but I still feel it sometimes, late at night, when the wind is quiet and the house is still. I'll catch the faintest hint of a tune, and my blood will run cold. I moved out of that house a month later. My dad didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew. Some nights, I wonder if the whistler is still out there, waiting, and some nights, I wonder if he's already found me again. The first time I saw the door, it was in a place it shouldn't have been, wedged between the bakery and the hardware store on the busiest street in town. I'd walked that route countless times and never noticed it before. It wasn't flashy, just an old wooden door painted deep green, with a brass handle dulled by time. Above it, in faint gold lettering, were the words "The Verdant Room." I almost walked past it. People jostled me on the sidewalk, their conversations blending into the chaotic hum of the city, but something about the door stopped me. It was the kind of stillness that didn't belong there, as if the rest of the world bent around it. I didn't think twice before pushing it open. Inside, it was nothing like I expected. The noise of the street vanished, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the scent of damp earth. The room stretched impossibly far, its walls covered in cascading ivy that glowed faintly, casting emerald shadows. The floor was made of polished stone, cool underfoot, and in the center of the room stood a single table with 2 chairs. Sitting at the table was a man, though calling him a man felt inadequate. He was tall, his skin the color of pale birch, and his eyes shimmered like pools of liquid gold. His hair was dark and wild, threaded with strands of green that seemed to move as though caught in a breeze only he could feel. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and smooth, like the first notes of a cello. He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit." Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, to walk back through the door and pretend this never happened. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me to the table. He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "You found the verdant room. Not everyone does. You must have been looking for something." I shook my head. "I wasn't looking for anything. I was just walking," he interrupted. Yes, that's what they all say." "They?" "The others who find the door. You're not the first, though you might be the most interesting." He leaned forward, resting his chin on steepled fingers. "Do you know what this place is?" I shook my head again. "This is a crossroads," he said. "A place where paths converge and choices are made. You, my friend, are at a point of decision." "I didn't make any decisions to come here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Not consciously, no. But deep down, you have questions, longings. You wouldn't have found the door if you didn't." He tapped the table, and the polished surface rippled like water. "The verdant room shows you what might be, what could have been, what still might be." I stared at the table as the ripples spread, forming images in the dark stone. The first was a memory, me as a child, standing at the edge of a swimming pool, too afraid to jump while other kids laughed and splashed around me. Then it shifted to a college classroom where I dropped out of a presentation halfway through, unable to bear the weight of 1,000 eyes. "What are you trying to show me?" I asked, my voice tight. "Choices," he said simply. "Moments where fear held you back. Doors you didn't open." I looked away, the ache in my chest growing. "I can't change those things. They're done." He smiled again, a glint of something mischievous in his eyes. "Who says they're done?" The table shifted again, the images dissolving into a swirling mist. This time, they reformed into something I didn't recognize, a version of me standing on a stage, speaking confidently to a crowd that hung on my every word. Another me, laughing with friends at a cafe that didn't exist in my world. A third me, sitting in a sunlit office, designing something intricate and beautiful. "This is what could be," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "All the things you thought were out of reach, all the paths you didn't walk, they're still there, waiting." The room seemed to grow warmer, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers. My pulse quickened as I watched the versions of myself play out lives I'd never imagined. "How?" I asked, the single word heavy with desperation. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, wooden box. Its surface was smooth, carved with delicate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. "Inside this box," he said, setting it on the table, "is the key to one of those lives. Choose wisely, and you'll step into a version of yourself that you've always dreamed of being." "And if I don't choose?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Then you leave the way you came. Nothing changes. The door will vanish, and this room will forget you." The box sat between us, impossibly heavy despite its size. I reached for it, my hand hovering just above the surface. "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's always a cost," he said, his golden eyes gleaming. "You must leave something behind. A piece of yourself, a memory, a regret, a part of what makes you who you are." The weight of his words pressed down on me. I thought about the life I had, the one I'd grown tired of but was too afraid to leave. I thought about the lives I'd seen in the table, the possibilities that felt too good to be true. What happens if I choose wrong? He smiled, sharp and knowing. "That, my friend, is the game." I stared at the box, my thoughts racing. The scent of flowers grew stronger, almost intoxicating, and the room seemed to blur at the edges. Slowly, I reached out and opened the lid. Inside was a single seed, small and glowing faintly with a soft green light. "What do I do with it?" I asked. "Plant it," he said, gesturing to the floor. The stone beneath my feet shifted, a patch of soil appearing as if conjured by the room itself. I knelt, the seed warm in my hand, and pressed it into the earth. The moment it disappeared, the room began to change. The ivy on the walls grew wild, curling and twisting into impossible shapes. The air shimmered, and the man's face seemed to blur, his features shifting like water. "Good luck," he said, his voice echoing as the room dissolved around me. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the stage I'd seen in the table. The lights were bright, the audience waiting, their faces expectant. The verdant room was gone, but the seed I'd planted had taken root. I used to be a dog walker. It was the kind of gig that paid just enough to keep me afloat while I figured out my life. Most of my clients were friendly professionals who'd leave detailed notes about feeding schedules and emergency numbers on the fridge. But then there was the Thompsons. The Thompsons lived at the edge of town, in a house that seemed too big for two people. It was a massive, old brick monstrosity with ivy-covered walls and windows that never seemed to let in enough light. They'd hired me to walk their dog, Max, for a week while they went on vacation. I'd never met Max before, but the Thompsons had assured me he was friendly. He wasn't. When I arrived on the first day, Max greeted me with a low growl from behind the iron gate. He was a huge German shepherd with mismatched eyes. One icy blue, the other a murky yellow. That seemed to see right through me. I almost turned around and left, but the Thompsons had already prepaid me in cash, and I couldn't afford to give it back. Once I got Max on a leash, he stopped growling, but he never wagged his tail. He didn't bark, didn't sniff the grass, didn't act like any dog I'd ever met. He just walked, his pace steady, his mismatched eyes scanning the street like he was on patrol. The first couple of days passed without incident. The routine was simple. Pick Max up, walk him around the block, bring him back, and leave the key under the flower pot by the front door. The house was always dark and silent, the air inside heavy with the smell of old wood and something faintly sour. I tried not to linger. On the third day, I noticed something strange. Max always pulled toward the woods. The Thompsons' house backed onto a dense stretch of forest, the kind of place that swallowed the sunlight even on a clear day. Every time we passed the edge of the woods, Max would stop and stare into the trees, his body tense, ears perked. Then he'd pull hard on the leash, like he was desperate to go in. "Come on, buddy," I'd say, tugging him back. "We're sticking to the sidewalk." He'd eventually relent, but not without a fight. I chalked it up to animal instinct. Maybe he smelled a rabbit or a deer. That night, I dreamed about the woods. In the dream, I was standing on the edge of the trees, staring into the darkness. Something moved between the trunks, a shadow that didn't belong. I couldn't see its shape, but I could hear it breathing, deep, wet, and guttural. Max was there, too, sitting beside me, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He turned to look at me, his mouth opening to speak. But before he could, I woke up. The next day, Max was worse. As soon as I clipped the leash to his collar, he bolted for the woods, dragging me behind him. I barely managed to hold on, the leash cutting into my hand as he lunged toward the tree line. "Max, stop!" I shouted, digging in my heels. He froze, his body rigid, his mismatched eyes fixed on something deep in the forest. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows and leaves. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. That night, I had the dream again. Only this time, the shadow stepped closer. It didn't make sense. It didn't have legs, or arms, or even a clear form. It was just wrong. A mass of darkness that seemed to bend the trees around it. And it was coming toward me. The next morning, I decided I was done. I walked up to the Thompsons' house, ready to call it quits. But when I reached the front door, something caught my eye. The flower pot where I always left the key was overturned, the key missing. I frowned, knocking on the door. "Hello?" I called, peering through the window. The house was dark, as usual, but something was off. The air smelled stronger, that sour tang now so sharp it made my eyes water. And then I heard it, a low growl, coming from inside. "Max?" I called, my voice shaking. The growl grew louder, echoing through the house. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, fumbling for my phone. Just as I turned to leave, the door creaked open. Max stood there, his blue and yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. His lips were pulled back in a snarl, his teeth impossibly sharp. But it wasn't just Max. Behind him, deep in the shadows of the hallway, something moved. It was the shadow from my dream. I froze, unable to breathe, as the darkness seemed to ripple, bending the air around it. It slithered forward, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the blackness, twisted, screaming faces that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Max stepped forward, his growl low and guttural. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking past me, toward the woods. And then, he bolted. The leash was still clipped to his collar, dragging behind him as he ran toward the forest. I stood there, frozen, torn between chasing him and running in the opposite direction. I didn't chase him. The Thompsons never came back. A week later, I saw a news report about their disappearance. Their car was still in the driveway, the house locked from the inside. No one could explain it. I quit dog walking after that, moved to a new city, got a desk job, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Max, about the shadow in the hallway, about the way the woods seemed to call to him. And sometimes, I hear a low growl outside my window. Not the usual kind. No ringing, no vibrating. My phone lit up on its own, the screen glowing faintly in the dark room. The caller ID didn't show a name or number, just a single word, unknown. I don't know why I answered it. It was late, past midnight, and I was already half asleep. Maybe it was the eerie silence that filled the room, or the way the phone seemed to pulse in my hand. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse. At first, there was only static, crackling faintly in my ear. Then a voice, faint and distorted, barely more than a whisper. "Do you remember the promise?" The hairs on my arms stood up. "Who is this?" "The promise," the voice repeated, a strange edge creeping into its tone. "You said you wouldn't forget." I hung up, my heart racing. I didn't make promises to strangers. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. Weird prank calls happen, right? Probably some bored teenager messing with people. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed again. A text message. It was from the same unknown number. "You shouldn't have forgotten. Come back to where it started." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I didn't reply. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing I'd read it. But the words gnawed at me. Come back to where it started. What did that mean? The texts kept coming. "You're running out of time. It's waiting. You know where to go." By evening, I was unnerved but still trying to convince myself it was just a prank. I turned off my phone, figuring that would stop the messages. But that night, as I sat in my living room with the TV on low, my landline rang. I didn't even remember installing a landline. The sound startled me so much that I just stared at the phone, its old-fashioned receiver vibrating with the force of the ring. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I picked it up, my hand trembling. "Hello?" Static again, but underneath it, I could hear something else, something faint and rhythmic, like footsteps on gravel. I slammed the receiver down, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The next morning, I woke to find a slip of paper on my nightstand. It wasn't there when I went to bed. It was old, yellowed around the edges, with faint, spidery handwriting that read, "The lake." That's when it hit me. The lake. It had been years since I'd thought about it, but the memories flooded back like a dam breaking. The summer camp I went to as a kid. The lake at the edge of the property, surrounded by dense woods. The promise I'd made. The promise I'd broken. Back then, it had been a dare. A group of us had snuck out after dark, laughing and shushing each other as we crept toward the lake. It was supposed to be harmless fun, but then someone had whispered about the stories, the ones the counselors told to keep us from wandering off, about something in the lake, something ancient and hungry. "Say the words," one of my friends had urged, holding out a flashlight like a talisman. The words. It was supposed to be a game, a ritual, something to scare ourselves with before running back to the safety of our cabins. But I'd been the one to say them. The chant was nonsense, a string of sounds that didn't make sense. But I'd said them anyway, my voice carrying across the still water. The others had laughed nervously, but I'd felt something shift in the air, like the lake was listening. Then we heard the splash. We ran, of course. What else would a group of kids do? We laughed about it the next day, convinced it was just a fish or a branch falling into the water. But I hadn't gone back to the lake after that, and I hadn't thought about the promise I'd made, to return. Now, it seemed, the lake hadn't forgotten. That night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I packed a bag, grabbed a flashlight, and drove the 3 hours to the place I swore I'd never return to. The camp was long abandoned, the cabins rotting and overgrown with weeds. The lake was exactly as I remembered it, silent and still, its surface smooth as glass. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I stood at the edge of the water, my flashlight beams skimming the surface. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the water rippled. It started in the center, spreading outward in perfect concentric circles. I took a step back. The voice came again, soft and echoing, as if carried on the wind. You broke the promise. The water churned violently, something massive moving just beneath the surface. It's waiting for you. I dropped the flashlight and ran, the sound of splashing water and cracking branches following me through the woods. I don't remember how I made it back to my car, only that when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. Its face was indistinct, shifting and blurred, but its eyes burned like coals. I don't sleep anymore. Not really. Sometimes, I hear the sound of water lapping against the shore. Sometimes, I hear the whisper. It's waiting. The first time the phone rang, it was 2:33 a.m. I woke up groggy, disoriented, squinting at the glowing numbers on my bedside clock. The sound was sharp, shrill, cutting through the quiet of my apartment like a razor. My phone screen glowed on the nightstand, the word unknown flashing across it. I let it ring. The call ended after the 5th ring, and I rolled over, ready to fall back asleep. But before I could, the phone rang again. Same number, same time. Reluctantly, I picked it up, my voice scratchy as I muttered, "Hello?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint, crackling sound, like static on an old radio. "Who is this?" I asked, more awake now. The static grew louder, and then I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, whispering something I couldn't make out. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it back on the nightstand. It was probably a wrong number or a prank, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next night, it rang again. Same time, same number. This time, I didn't answer. The ringing stopped, but a minute later, I got a voicemail notification. My stomach twisted as I played it back. The static was louder now, almost deafening, and underneath it, I could hear faint whispers. It wasn't a language I recognized, just a series of sounds, guttural and alien, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. I deleted the message and tried to go back to sleep, but my dreams were restless, filled with strange, fragmented images. A forest bathed in pale, sickly light, a figure standing at the edge of a clearing, its face obscured. The calls came every night after that. At first, I ignored them. Then I started turning my phone off entirely before bed, but somehow, the calls still came. I'd wake up to find my phone powered on, the voicemail notifications waiting for me. The whispers grew clearer, sharper, until I could almost make out words. Almost. By the 7th night, I was too scared to sleep. I sat on the couch, phone clutched in my hand, staring at it as if it might explode. When the clock struck 2:33, the phone lit up, vibrating in my hand. I answered it. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want?" The static surged, and the voice whispered something that made my skin crawl. "You know me." I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as the voice continued, soft and sing-song, like it was repeating a lullaby. "Come find me," it said. "I'm waiting." The line went dead. The next morning, I called my service provider, demanding to know where the calls were coming from. The woman on the other end sounded puzzled. "There's no record of any incoming calls at that time," she said. "Are you sure? It happens every night." "I'm sorry, but there's nothing in our logs." Her voice was calm, professional, but I could tell she thought I was crazy. That night, the dreams returned. I was standing in the forest again, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches clawing at the sky. In the distance, I saw the figure, the same one as before. It was closer this time, its outline sharper. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and I felt a wave of cold air rush over me, sharp and biting. "You know me," it said, in the same voice from the calls. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The phone was ringing again. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I threw the phone into a drawer and left the apartment, needing fresh air, needing space. The streets were empty, bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights. As I walked, I felt it. A presence. Something watching me. I turned, and there it was. The figure stood at the end of the block, tall and thin, its face shrouded in shadow. I ran. When I got back to the apartment, my phone was lying on the kitchen counter. I knew I hadn't left it there. The screen was lit, a new voicemail waiting. With shaking hands, I played it. This time, the voice was clear. "I'm closer now. I haven't slept since. The calls keep coming, and the figure is no longer content to stay in my dreams. It's here, in the real world, waiting just beyond the edge of the light." And last night, when I looked into the mirror, I saw it standing behind me. The whole thing started with a post-it note, bright yellow, stuck to the inside of my front door. I didn't think much of it at first, just a little square with 2 words scrawled in black marker, "Stay inside." Weird, sure, but I figured maybe I'd written it myself and forgotten. I'd been pulling long hours at work, and my memory was foggy. It wouldn't have been the first time I left myself a reminder that no longer made sense the next day. I crumpled it up and tossed it, not thinking about it again until the next morning, when I found another one. Same handwriting, same message, "Stay inside." This time, it was stuck to my bathroom mirror. I live alone. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I checked all the locks on my doors and windows. They were secure. Nothing was out of place. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe one of my friends was messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. By the 3rd day, the notes were everywhere. One was taped to my coffee maker when I woke up. Another was stuck to my car's windshield when I tried to leave for work. A third was on the inside of my fridge, sitting neatly on top of a carton of eggs. Every single one had the same 2 words, "Stay inside." I called my best friend, Melanie, to tell her what was happening. "That's creepy as hell," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "You should call the cops." "And say what?" I asked. "That someone's leaving post-its in my house? They'll think I'm losing it." "Well, you're not staying there alone tonight," she said firmly. "Come crash at my place." That sounded like a good plan. I packed a bag and headed for the door, only to stop dead in my tracks when I saw the latest note stuck to the doorknob. "Do not leave." I stared at it, my hands trembling. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls were leaning in. The light from the windows seemed dimmer, though the sky outside was clear and bright. The note hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. I called Melanie again, my voice shaking. "I think someone's in my house." She told me to leave immediately, to get outside and call the police. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But as I reached for the doorknob, something stopped me. A deep, primal sense of wrongness. The air outside the door didn't look right. It shimmered, faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt. And there was a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like static just beneath the range of hearing. I backed away. That night, I stayed locked in my bedroom with all the lights on, a knife clutched in my hand. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The notes kept coming. By the end of the week, they changed. "Do not look outside. It sees you. Stay in the light." I stopped sleeping. The worst part wasn't the notes. It was the reflection. It started small, catching movement in the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. But one night, as I passed by the bathroom mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, staring at the mirror. My reflection stared back, its eyes too wide, its mouth twitching like it wanted to smile. Slowly, its head tilted to the side, something I hadn't done. Then it whispered, "Stay inside." I ran. I don't know how long I've been in the house now. Days? Weeks? Time feels warped, like the clocks are moving slower than they should. I've tried to leave, but every time I open the door, that shimmering air is waiting for me, thick and buzzing with static. And now, the notes are different again. IT is here. Do not trust yourself. Do not turn around. The last one appeared on my bedroom wall this morning. I haven't turned around since. The library wasn't on any map. I found it while walking home late one night, cutting through a part of town I didn't usually venture into. The streets were quiet, the buildings old and darkened. I had no reason to look down the narrow side street, no reason to pause, but something about the flicker of light at the end of it caught my attention. The building was tucked between two crumbling brick warehouses, its facade impossibly pristine. A small brass sign above the door read, "Midnight Archives." The name sent a strange shiver down my spine, and before I even realized what I was doing, I was stepping inside. The smell hit me first. Old paper, ink, and something faintly floral. The air was warm, heavy, and humming with a quiet energy. The room stretched far longer than the building should have allowed. Shelves upon shelves of books receding into the dim light. There was no one at the front desk, no sign of staff or other visitors. A single lamp on the counter illuminated a logbook, its pages filled with names in looping, elaborate handwriting. I ran my fingers over the open page, the ink still slightly wet beneath my fingertips. The names were unfamiliar, but something about them felt oddly specific. I was about to leave when I noticed the shelves. They weren't organized by genre or author, as you'd expect. Instead, the spines were labeled with names. Full names. And one of them was mine. My feet carried me to it before my brain caught up. The book was small, bound in soft black leather. My full name gleamed in gold lettering across the spine, and beneath it, in smaller text, was today's date. I pulled the book from the shelf, my heart racing. It wasn't heavy, but it felt dense, like it held more than it should. The pages were blank at first, crisp and white. But as I flipped through, words began to appear, unfolding line by line, as if an invisible pen were writing them in real time. It was my story, not just my life as I remembered it, but details I'd long forgotten. My third grade spelling bee. The first time I scraped my knee learning to ride a bike. The fight I'd had with my sister last Christmas. And then, about halfway through the book, the words stopped recounting my past and began describing something else entirely. The moment I had walked into the library, I froze, staring at the words as they appeared. She stands in the aisle, holding her book, her breath quickening as she realizes the story isn't over. The pages she hasn't turned are already written, waiting for her to see, waiting for her to understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, I flipped to the next page. It described me running my fingers over the paper, reading this exact sentence, and then the next. She hears the door creak behind her and realizes she's not alone. I spun around. At the end of the aisle, silhouetted in the faint light, was a figure. Tall, angular, and unnervingly still. Its face was obscured, but its head was tilted slightly, as though it were observing me. I clutched the book to my chest, my pulse thundering. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, but something in its presence made my skin crawl. I turned back to the book, flipping forward, desperate for an answer. The next line read, "The figure steps closer, its shadow stretching across the aisle. She tries to run, but the shelves seem to shift around her, closing in. As if on cue, the figure began to move. Its footsteps were silent, but I could feel the air grow colder with each step it took. I bolted, weaving through the aisles, but the words in the book kept writing themselves, each one perfectly matching what was happening. She turns left, only to find another row of books. She turns right, and the shelves curve endlessly, leading her in circles. The figure is always just behind her, just out of sight. I was trapped. No matter which way I ran, the library seemed to shift around me, bending the space between shelves. The light grew dimmer, the air heavier. Finally, I stumbled into a small alcove, hidden between two towering bookcases. A single table sat in the center, with another book already waiting there. Its cover was identical to mine, but the name on the spine wasn't mine. It was the figure's. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The leather felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath my fingers. The first page was blank, but as I stared at it, words began to appear. She holds the book, realizing that her story has ended where his begins. The trade is inevitable. One must leave for the other to remain. I looked up, and the figure was there, closer than it had ever been, its face still obscured, but its presence impossibly heavy. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the book in my arms. It wanted mine. The room seemed to shift, the walls pressing closer. My own book felt unbearably heavy now, its pages humming with an energy that made my teeth ache. I didn't want to let it go, but I had no choice. I placed the book on the table, and the figure's book in its place. The moment I did, the figure receded, melting into the shadows. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting. I ran. When I burst through the door, the city was bright again, the noise of traffic and life flooding my senses. I turned back, but the library was gone. The alley was empty, save for the faint smell of old paper lingering in the air. I still have the book I took. It's blank now, its pages pristine and waiting. I don't know whose story it belongs to, but sometimes, late at night, I feel compelled to open it, and I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is reading mine. I don't know why I stopped at the roadside stand. It was late, close to midnight, and I was driving through a rural stretch of highway that seemed to stretch forever. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating fields of swaying corn and the occasional weather-beaten barn. The stand appeared out of nowhere. A little shack bathed in the weak glow of a single hanging bulb. A hand-painted sign read, "Open late. Fresh goods." Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the place, or the strangeness of finding a stand open at that hour, but I pulled over. As I got out of the car, the night felt heavier, like the air was pressing against my skin. The stand was simple, cluttered with baskets of apples, jars of honey, and a few loaves of rustic bread. The apples caught my eye immediately. They were enormous, almost unnaturally red, their skins glistening in the dim light. I reached out to pick one up, but a voice stopped me. "Careful," it said, low and calm. "Those ain't for everyone." I turned to see a man sitting in the shadows, his face hidden under the brim of a wide hat. He was thin, his long limbs almost spindly, and he didn't look up as he spoke. His hands were busy carving something small and wooden, the shavings falling into a pile at his feet. "I'm just looking," I said, though my fingers still hovered over the apples. The man chuckled, a dry sound that didn't quite reach his voice. "Look all you want, but the fruit's special. Only take what's meant for you." I raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "Meant for me? What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer, just kept carving. The wood in his hands began to take shape, a crude figure, vaguely human, with long, stretched limbs and an odd tilt to its head. Something about it made me uneasy. Shrugging off the man's cryptic comment, I grabbed an apple and a jar of honey, leaving a $10 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," I said, feeling more eager to get back to my car than I wanted to admit. The man didn't respond. Back on the road, I glanced at the apple sitting in the passenger seat. It looked perfect, as if it had been polished to an impossible shine. Without thinking, I took a bite. The flavor was indescribable, sweet and tart all at once, with a crispness that made every store-bought apple I'd ever eaten seem like cardboard. For a moment, the exhaustion of the drive melted away, replaced by a strange, giddy energy. But then something changed. The road seemed darker somehow, the headlights barely cutting through the night. The air felt heavier, and the car's engine began to hum with an odd, vibrating noise that I could feel in my teeth. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse quickening. That's when I saw the figure in the road. It was standing in the middle of the highway, silhouetted against the night, tall and thin, with arms that hung too low and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side, just like the wooden figure the man had been carving. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. My heart pounded as I stared at the thing. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the pavement. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The figure took a single step forward, and that was enough to snap me into action. I threw the car into reverse, the engine whining as I sped backward down the highway. The figure didn't follow. It simply watched, its head tilting further to the side as I retreated. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the stand long behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, the taste of the apple still lingering in my mouth, now bitter and metallic. I tossed the half-eaten fruit out the window, my stomach churning. When I finally reached the next town, I checked into a motel and locked the door behind me. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the road, its shadow twisting and stretching toward me. The next morning, I tried to find the stand again. I drove up and down the highway for hours, but it was gone. No shack, no light, no sign. Just endless cornfields and an empty road. That was years ago, but I still think about that night. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone late at night, I catch a glimpse of something tall and thin in the distance. It's never there when I look again, but I know it's watching, waiting. I don't eat apples anymore. A small, unmarked package showed up at my doorstep one rainy Tuesday morning. No return address, no shipping label, just my name scrawled across the top in shaky black marker. I wasn't expecting anything, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside the package was a single object, a plain black notebook. The cover was unmarked, the pages smooth and blank. At first, I thought it was just an ordinary notebook, the kind you buy at a dollar store. But when I flipped it open, a strange smell hit me, like burnt paper and something metallic, almost like blood. I tossed it on my kitchen counter, assuming it was some weird prank, and went about my day. That night, I found the notebook on my bed. I didn't put it there. When I picked it up, the first page wasn't blank anymore. Write something. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Yeah, no thanks, I muttered, and shoved it back into the package. But the next morning, the notebook was back on the counter, wide open to a fresh page. Write something, please. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to prove it was just some elaborate hoax, or maybe the tone of the message, pleading, almost desperate, unnerved me. Whatever the reason, I grabbed a pen and wrote the first thing that came to mind. This is stupid. The ink sank into the page unnaturally fast, like the paper was thirsty for it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the words faded. They didn't smudge or disappear like ink normally would. They dissolved, slowly, until the page was blank again. When I turned the page, there was a new message waiting for me. Thank you. Tell me more. It felt ridiculous, like I was talking to a piece of paper. But the longer I stared at it, the more compelled I felt to respond. I wrote about my day, how it had rained all morning, how work was slow, how my neighbor's cat had scratched my car. Again, the words faded, and the notebook replied, I'm glad you're here. It became a nightly ritual. I'd sit down with the notebook and write. Sometimes I told it mundane things, what I ate for breakfast, which podcasts I listened to. Other times, I shared more personal details, memories from childhood, dreams I barely remembered. The notebook always replied. Its responses were brief but thoughtful, like a quiet friend who was always listening. That must have been hard. I like that story. You're not alone. For a while, it was comforting. But then the notebook started asking questions. What's your favorite place in the world? What scares you the most? Have you ever felt watched? I didn't want to answer that last one, but when I tried to close the notebook, the words changed. Please, I need to know. Reluctantly, I wrote, sometimes. The reply came instantly, the ink almost frantic. They're watching now. My hands froze, the pen slipping from my fingers. The room felt colder, like a window had been left open, but everything was shut tight. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I locked the notebook in a drawer. The next morning, it was on my pillow. The page read, Why did you leave me? I stopped writing after that. For days, I ignored the notebook, leaving it untouched on the bookshelf. But it didn't ignore me. The messages started appearing everywhere. On sticky notes stuck to my bathroom mirror, write something. On receipts in my pocket, talk to me. Scribbled on the back of my hand when I woke up, please. One night, I found a note taped to the inside of my fridge. You're making them angry. That was when I started hearing the footsteps. They were faint at first, soft creaks in the floorboards that I convinced myself were just the building settling. But they grew louder, heavier, until it sounded like someone was pacing in the hallway outside my bedroom. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the hallway was empty. The notebook was sitting on the floor. Open. They want to come in. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and wrote, "Who are they?" The response bled onto the page in thick, heavy strokes. "You don't want to know." The footsteps stopped after that, but the feeling didn't go away. The sense that I was being watched, that something was just out of sight, waiting. Last night, the notebook asked me to draw something. I hesitated but finally sketched the first thing that came to mind. A crude drawing of a tree. The lines shimmered, the ink twisting on the page until it formed something else entirely, a doorway. The notebook wrote back, "Open it." I stared at the page, at the impossible doorway drawn in ink that seemed to pulse like it was alive. "Open it," the notebook repeated. This morning, the doorway was on my wall. It wasn't there before. I'm sure of it. It looks exactly like the drawing, tall and narrow, with jagged edges. When I touch it, the surface is cold and damp, like stone slicked with rain. The notebook is waiting for me on the floor beneath it. The page says, "It's time." And underneath, in smaller letters, "They're already inside." The first time I noticed the girl, I was in the middle of traffic. It had been a frustrating commute. Rain hammered the windshield, the wipers working overtime to clear the streaks, and the highway was clogged with brake lights stretching endlessly ahead. I was drumming my fingers against the steering wheel, lost in the rhythm of a distant radio DJ's voice, when something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, amidst the blur of headlights and the mist rising from the asphalt, she stood on the shoulder of the road. A girl in a tattered white dress, barefoot, her hair dripping wet. She wasn't running, wasn't waving for help, just standing still, her face partially obscured by her hair. I stared for a second too long, and the honk of the car behind me jolted me forward. When I glanced back, she was gone. The drive home was uneventful after that. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped, and the neighborhood was bathed in the cool glow of streetlights. I chalked the girl up to a trick of the rain and the rearview mirror, a momentary glitch in my tired mind. But as I shut the car door and turned toward my house, I froze. She was standing at the edge of my yard. This time, I saw her clearly. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her small frame, and her feet were caked with mud. Her head was tilted slightly, and though I couldn't see her face in the dim light, I felt her eyes on me, watching. I opened my mouth to say something. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" But the words died in my throat. My pulse thundered in my ears. The distance between us felt impossibly vast and painfully close all at once. And then, she moved. Not forward, not away. Just a flicker, like she'd stepped sideways into the dark. One moment she was there, the next, gone. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind made my skin crawl. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see her standing outside, but the yard remained empty. The next day at work, everything felt off. My computer lagged strangely, as though it were processing something I hadn't clicked. The office felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in a way I'd never noticed before. And my coworkers, people I'd worked with for years, seemed distant, like they were looking through me instead of at me. That night, the girl was waiting again. Not in the yard this time, but in the reflection of my living room window. I just turned off the TV and was heading to bed when I saw her. She was behind me, standing in the middle of the room, her hair dripping water onto the hardwood floor. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. No one was there, but the floor was wet. The days blurred together after that. She was everywhere now. I'd catch glimpses of her in mirrors, in windows, in the shadows at the edges of my vision. Sometimes she was close enough that I could almost make out her face, her pale features distorted like something underwater. Other times, she was far away, standing just outside the reach of the streetlights, her white dress glowing faintly in the dark. The worst part wasn't seeing her, though. It was the sound. At first, it was subtle, a faint dripping, like water leaking from a faucet. But soon it grew louder, closer, until it felt like the walls themselves were saturated. The sound followed me everywhere, at home, at work, even in my car. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom drenched. The bed, the carpet, the walls, everything was soaked, as though I'd been submerged in a lake. I stumbled to the bathroom, shivering, and when I looked in the mirror, she was standing behind me. Her reflection didn't move. Mine did. "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" Her head tilted, water dripping from her hair. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming a single word I couldn't hear. Then the mirror cracked, splintering into a web of fractures that stretched outward like frozen lightning. I didn't stay in the apartment after that. I packed a bag and drove until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I checked into a motel on the edge of a small town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and vending machines that only take quarters. The room smelled faintly of mildew, but it was dry, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I fell asleep almost immediately, the hum of the ancient AC unit lulling me into a dreamless slumber. But when I woke up, she was there, standing at the foot of the bed, her dress still dripping, her hair hanging in limp, sodden strands. Her face was clearer now, pale and hollow, her eyes dark and endless. "You shouldn't have left," she said, her voice low and echoing, like it was coming from underwater. I scrambled back against the headboard, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" Her head tilted again, her expression unreadable. "Come back," she whispered. "It's waiting." "What's waiting?" I shouted, but she didn't answer. She only stepped closer, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the carpet. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled the room, and the walls began to warp, bending inward as though the space itself were collapsing. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. I left the motel that morning, driving without direction, desperate to outrun her. But no matter how far I go, no matter how fast, she finds me. In mirrors, in reflections, in the corners of darkened rooms. I think I know what she meant now. I think I know what's waiting. And I think I'm running out of time. The old bookstore wasn't on any map, and yet, somehow, everyone who lived in the city seemed to know about it. Tucked away in an alley that twisted like a forgotten thought, its facade was as unremarkable as the rest of the street. A wooden sign above the door read Braxton's Books, the paint peeling just enough to suggest decades of quiet existence. I didn't intend to find it. I wasn't even looking for books. But the rain had started, cold and relentless, and the glow of the shop's window, faint and golden, felt like a safe harbor in the storm. A bell chimed softly as I pushed open the door, the sound warm and welcoming. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and aged wood, a smell that felt like slipping into a memory. Bookshelves stretched floor to ceiling, towering over me like ancient trees in a library forest. Behind the counter sat a man. At least, I assumed he was a man. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, his hands busy with an open book that he seemed to be writing in rather than reading. He didn't look up as I entered, only spoke in a voice that was low and steady. "You'll find what you need in the back." I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy coat. "I'm not looking for anything," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. He chuckled, a sound that felt more like the creak of an old floorboard than laughter. "Everyone says that. Go on." Something about him made me move without thinking, my feet carrying me deeper into the shop. The aisles were narrow, the books packed so tightly it felt like the shelves were leaning in, listening. Titles jumped out at me, names I didn't recognize but that stirred a strange familiarity. The House That Waited, Memories Borrowed in Blue, 1,000 Forgotten Doors. At the very back of the shop, the air grew colder, the light dimmer. A single book sat on a pedestal, its cover plain black and unmarked. The edges of its pages glinted faintly, as though they were dusted with gold. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and opened it. The pages weren't blank, but they weren't filled with words either. Instead, they held moving images, like tiny films projected onto the paper. The first scene was of a girl, a younger version of me, sitting alone on a swing, her face streaked with tears. I remembered that day. I'd fallen off my bike, skinned my knees, and run to the park to cry where no one could see me. Except someone had. A boy with messy hair and kind eyes had offered me a Band-Aid and stayed until I stopped crying. But as I watched, the scene changed. The boy reached into his pocket, pulling out a locket instead of the Band-Aid. He opened it, revealing a tiny photograph I couldn't make out, and handed it to me. That hadn't happened. I flipped to the next page, and another memory played out. This time of me sitting in a hospital room, holding my grandmother's hand. The beeping of machines filled the air, the scent of antiseptic sharp and unyielding. But just as before, the scene twisted. My grandmother spoke words I didn't remember, her voice clear and strong. "You have to finish what I couldn't," she said, her gaze intense. "What does this mean?" I whispered, the weight of the book heavy in my hands. "It means you've been given a choice," said the voice behind me. I turned sharply, startled to see the man from the counter standing there, his hat still shadowing his face. "This book," he continued, gesturing toward it, "is your story. Or rather, it's your story as it could have been." I frowned, my grip tightening on the book. "What are you talking about?" He reached out, brushing his fingers over the edge of the pages. "Every decision we make creates echoes, ripples that form paths we'll never walk. But some paths linger, waiting for the right moment to call you back. You're saying I can change my past?" "Not quite." He smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "You can step into one of these paths, live the life you didn't choose. But only one. And once you choose, there's no coming back." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Why me? Why now?" "Because you found the door," he said simply. "Or perhaps it found you." The room seemed to grow quieter, the books around us holding their breath. I looked down at the open pages, the images shifting again. This time, I saw a life that felt distant and foreign. Me in a bustling city, surrounded by people who seemed to know me, respect me. A woman handed me a microphone, and I stood on a stage, speaking with a confidence I'd never felt in my real life. I flipped the page. Now I was in a sunlit kitchen, laughter echoing around me as a child with my eyes and a man I didn't recognize spun in circles, their joy infectious. Another page. This time, I stood in a gallery, staring at a painting I knew I'd created but couldn't remember ever making. The possibilities seemed endless, each one pulling at a different part of me. "What happens if I don't choose?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man shrugged, stepping back into the shadows. "Then you leave the way you came. Your life continues, just as it is. But the door won't open for you again." The weight of his words settled over me like a stone. My life wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough. It was a patchwork of safe choices and almosts, of dreams deferred and opportunities missed. I looked back at the book, its pages shimmering faintly, waiting. Slowly, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against one of the scenes. A version of me standing in a field of golden light, my face calm, serene, like I'd finally found something I'd been searching for. The moment my hand touched the page, the world around me dissolved. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the field, the sun warm against my skin. The air smelled of wildflowers, and in the distance, a small house waited, its door open, inviting. The bookstore, the man, the book, they were gone. But the life ahead of me was mine to live. It began with a door that shouldn't have been there. I'd been renting my apartment for 3 years. It wasn't anything special, just a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old brick building that creaked whenever the wind blew. I knew every corner of the place, every chipped tile, every drafty window. So when I came home from work one evening and saw the door, I froze. It was in the hallway, between my bathroom and the bedroom. A plain, Unassuming door with a dull brass handle and no markings. The kind of door you wouldn't look twice at if it had always been there. But it hadn't. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. I even reached out and touched it, half expecting my hand to go through it like a hologram, but it was solid, real. I tried to open it. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. No amount of pushing, pulling, or shoulder checking made it move. By the time I gave up, my chest was tight with unease. I grabbed my phone and texted my landlord, asking if there had been any renovations or repairs while I was out. His response came quickly, "Nope. Everything should be the same." I didn't reply. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The door was there, just a few feet away, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined it creaking open, something stepping out. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails on wood. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. The door. The scratching was coming from the other side. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was only silence. I told myself it was a dream, some half-waking nightmare, and tried to go back to sleep. But the next morning, when I walked past the door, I noticed something new. There were scratches on the surface. Long, jagged lines etched into the wood, as if something had been clawing to get out. I moved out a week later. I wish that had been the end of it. The first night in my new apartment, I felt a strange sense of relief. No mysterious doors, no eerie noises. Just me and my boxes, surrounded by the comforting mundanity of an empty, undecorated space. But when I woke up the next morning, there it was. The door. It stood in the corner of the living room, where a blank wall had been the night before. Same dull brass handle, same unmarked wood. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This time, there were no scratches, just a piece of paper taped to the door. The paper was blank. I stared at it for what felt like hours, hoping it would reveal some kind of clue, some explanation, but it didn't. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge, like it was glued in place. I didn't touch the handle this time. I tried to go about my day, pretending the door wasn't there, but it was impossible to ignore. Every time I passed it, I felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to do something. That night, the scratching started again. This time, it was louder. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on, gripping a kitchen knife and staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., the scratching stopped. I stayed where I was, waiting, my heart racing. And then, slowly, the handle began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open, just a crack. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes your ears ring. I didn't move. I couldn't. From the darkness beyond the door, something whispered, "I see you." The words were soft, almost playful, but they sent a jolt of terror through me. The door slammed shut, and the room went silent. When the sun came up, the door was gone. I don't know how to explain what's happening, and I don't think I want to. The door keeps finding me. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it always appears. Sometimes it's in a closet. Sometimes it's in the bathroom. Once, I woke up to find it at the foot of my bed. I've stopped trying to open it. I've stopped asking questions. But the scratching never stops. And I know one day, it won't stay closed. It began with the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint whiff of something earthy and damp, like old leaves after a rainstorm. I noticed it when I moved into my new apartment, but I chalked it up to the building's age. The place was cheap and charming in its own rundown way. Creaky floorboards, exposed brick, a clawfoot tub. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it had character, and that's what I told myself I was paying for. The smell lingered, though. It didn't fade, and it wasn't coming from the trash or the plumbing. It seemed to be coming from the floor, specifically, a spot in the center of the living room. At first, I tried cleaning, scrubbing, vacuuming, even sprinkling baking soda on the rug and leaving it overnight. Nothing worked. The smell stayed, faint but persistent, like it was waiting for me to notice it fully. A few nights later, I heard the creaking. It started around midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crossing the living room. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing. My breath caught in my throat. I lived alone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the living room. The footsteps stopped the moment I reached the doorway. The room was empty, bathed in the dim orange glow of a street lamp outside. The smell was stronger now. The next morning, I called the landlord. He sounded annoyed, like I'd interrupted something more important than a potential intruder. "It's an old building," he said. "Things creak. That's what they do." "What about the smell?" I asked. He sighed heavily. "I'll send someone to check it out." The handyman came by later that week. He was a wiry, middle-aged guy with a cigarette dangling from his lips as he inspected the living room floor. After a few minutes, he shook his head. "Nothing here," he said. "Maybe a dead mouse in the walls, but I don't see any damage or stains." He left without another word, and I was left with the same creaking floor and the same smell. That night, the pacing returned. It was louder this time, the footsteps heavier, like whoever, or whatever, was in the living room wanted me to hear it. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers, too scared to move. And then, I heard it, a low, guttural groan. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from beneath the floor. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I moved the rug, exposing the worn wood beneath. At first glance, everything looked normal, but when I pressed my ear to the floorboards, I heard it again. A faint, almost human sound, like someone whispering. I grabbed a screwdriver and pried up one of the boards. The smell hit me immediately, overpowering and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach churned, but I kept going, pulling up more boards until I exposed a small, dark hole. The hole wasn't part of the building's original design. It was rough, dug into the earth beneath the floor. I shone a flashlight into the hole and saw something glinting at the bottom. It was a key. The key was old and rusted, with an ornate design carved into the head. It felt wrong in my hand, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. That night, the pacing didn't stop. It moved from the living room to the hallway, the footsteps growing louder and more erratic. I locked myself in my bedroom, but the creaking grew closer, stopping just outside the door. And then, the whispering began. It was faint at first, like someone murmuring just below the range of understanding. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, clearer. "Let me out." I didn't sleep. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed the key, and left, planning to stay with a friend until I figured out what to do. But the key wouldn't let me go. Everywhere I went, I felt it. A weight in my pocket, an unrelenting presence. I started hearing the whispering even during the day, faint and insistent. "Let me out." I couldn't take it anymore. Last night, I returned to the apartment. The smell was worse, the air heavy and oppressive. The whispering was constant now, filling every corner of the space. I followed the sound back to the hole in the floor. The earth beneath was looser now, almost as if it had been disturbed. I grabbed a shovel and started digging, my hands trembling. It didn't take long to find the box. It was small and wooden, bound with iron clasps and covered in strange symbols. The key fit perfectly into the lock. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But the whispering wouldn't let me. "Let me out." I turned the key. The box didn't open so much as it released. An explosion of cold air and darkness that filled the room. The whispering turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows seemed to take shape, coalescing into something massive and ancient. It stood before me, towering and amorphous, its form shifting like smoke. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened across its surface, all of them fixed on me. "Thank you," it said, its voice a deep, guttural rumble. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, the apartment was silent. The hole was gone, the floorboards pristine, the key nowhere to be found. But the smell remains. And at night, when the house is quiet, I hear it. Footsteps, getting closer. I got the invitation in the mail on a Tuesday. The envelope was plain white, the kind you'd buy in bulk at a dollar store, and it had no return address. Inside was a single card, heavy and glossy, with gold foil lettering that read, "You are cordially invited to attend a private showing at the Vesper Gallery. Date, Friday, October 13th. Time, 9 p.m. At first, I thought it was junk mail. I didn't know what the Vesper Gallery was. I'd never heard of it, and I certainly hadn't been to any art openings lately. But there was something about the card that held my attention. The gold foil shimmered faintly in the light, and when I ran my fingers over the letters, they felt warm. I probably should have tossed it, but curiosity got the better of me, and by the time Friday rolled around, I found myself standing outside the address printed on the back of the card. The gallery was a narrow, unassuming building tucked between two empty storefronts. Its windows were dark, and there was no sign or nameplate, just a heavy black door with a brass knocker in the shape of a serpent. I almost turned back right then, but I'd come all this way, and besides, I figured it would make a good story to tell later. So I knocked. The door opened immediately, and a tall man in a black suit stepped aside to let me in. He didn't say a word, just motioned for me to follow. Inside, the gallery was nothing like I expected. The walls were painted a deep, velvety red, and soft, golden light poured from sconces shaped like outstretched hands. The air smelled faintly of incense, woody and sharp, and the space was silent except for the muffled sound of my footsteps on the plush carpet. There were other people there, maybe a dozen, all dressed in evening wear that made me feel underdressed in my jeans and sweater. They were scattered throughout the room, standing in front of the paintings that lined the walls. And the paintings, they were strange. At first glance, they looked like abstract works, swirls of black and crimson, jagged lines slashing across the canvas, textures so vivid they seemed to ripple. But the longer I stared, the more they seemed to shift, the shapes writhing and rearranging themselves. One painting caught my eye. It was taller than the others, stretching from floor to ceiling, and it depicted a dark, endless corridor lined with doors. The perspective was disorienting, as if the painting itself was pulling me in. I felt an odd compulsion to step closer, to reach out and touch it. "Don't linger too long." The voice startled me, and I turned to see a woman standing next to me. She was older, with sharp cheekbones and a black dress that looked expensive. Her eyes were fixed on the painting, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" I asked. She didn't look at me. "The paintings here are hungry." I thought she was joking, but there was no humor in her tone. Before I could ask her anything else, she walked away, leaving me alone with the painting. That's when I noticed the door. It wasn't part of the painting. It was real, a narrow wooden door set into the wall beside the frame. It hadn't been there when I walked in. A small, hand-lettered sign hung from the knob. "Private viewing." I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice the door. My heart was pounding, and every rational part of me screamed to leave it alone. But something about it called to me, the same way the card had, and before I knew it, my hand was on the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. It looked exactly like the one in the painting. I stepped inside. The air was colder here, damp and heavy, and the walls seemed to close in the farther I walked. The hallway stretched on, lined with identical doors, each one marked with a number. The numbers weren't in order. They skipped and doubled back, some written in Roman numerals, others in symbols I didn't recognize. One door was open. It was unmarked, the wood warped and splintered, and a faint light spilled out into the hall. I hesitated, then stepped closer, peering inside. The room was empty, except for a single easel in the center. On it was a blank canvas. At least, I thought it was blank. As I moved closer, I realized there was something there. A faint image, like a shadow pressed into the fabric. It grew sharper as I stared, and I felt my chest tighten. It was me. The figure on the canvas was standing in the exact position I was, wearing the same clothes, with the same look of wide-eyed horror. But as I watched, it moved. My reflection, my painting, turned its head and looked directly at me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and the canvas fell forward, hitting the ground with a deafening crash. The next thing I remember, I was outside, standing in the middle of the empty street. The gallery was gone. I've tried looking for it since then. I've searched every street, every corner, but there's no sign it ever existed. But last night, I found a painting in my living room. It wasn't there before. It's of me, standing in the hallway, looking into the room, and in the painting, the canvas on the easel isn't blank anymore. It's filled with figures, hundreds of them, pressed together, their faces distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. One of them looks just like the woman who warned me. Not my front door or my bedroom door, but a door that wasn't supposed to exist. I found it one morning while brushing my teeth. I glanced up at the mirror and saw it behind me, a narrow, wooden door with peeling green paint. It was wedged into the far corner of my bathroom, where I was absolutely certain there'd been nothing but blank tile the night before. I turned around slowly, toothbrush still in my hand. The door didn't belong. The way it stood there, slightly tilted, made the space around it feel wrong, like a jigsaw piece forced into the wrong puzzle. My apartment was old, sure, but I'd lived there for 3 years. I knew every inch of it, and this door wasn't part of it. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The handle was brass, tarnished and warm to the touch. For a moment, I just stood there, hand hovering over the knob, debating whether to open it. Some primal part of my brain screamed at me not to, but curiosity won out. I turned the knob and pulled. On the other side was darkness. Not the kind of darkness you get in an unlit room, but a deep, oppressive void that seemed to swallow the light around it. The air that seeped out smelled faintly metallic, like old coins and damp earth. I leaned in, squinting, trying to make out what lay beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving, shapes shifting in the blackness, like shadows writhing against each other. Then, before I could get a better look, the door slammed shut on its own. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was just there, solid and unmoving, like it had always been a part of the wall. I tried to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. The brass handle was icy cold now, almost burning my palm. I left the bathroom without brushing my teeth. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, I was standing in front of it again, but this time it wasn't in my bathroom. It was in the middle of a long, endless hallway. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floor covered in a thin layer of ash. The door was open, and the void was waiting. Something was standing in it. A figure, tall and thin. Its edges blurred as though it wasn't entirely real. It didn't have a face, just a smooth expanse of shadow where its features should have been, but I could feel it watching me. When I woke up, the smell of damp earth lingered in the air. Over the next few days, the door became a part of my life. I couldn't avoid it, no matter how much I tried. Every time I went into the bathroom, it was there, silent and looming. Some mornings it was open just a crack, enough for me to see the void shifting behind it. Other times, I'd find it locked, the handle rattling faintly as though someone, or something, was on the other side. I thought about calling my landlord, but what would I even say? Hey, there's a mysterious, otherworldly door in my bathroom, and I think it's watching me? So I did nothing, and the door waited. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it, the faint sound of knocking. It wasn't coming from my front door. I sat up, my chest tightening. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. I got out of bed and walked toward the bathroom, each step heavier than the last. The door was open. The void spilled out into the room, darkness pooling on the tile like ink. The smell of damp earth was overwhelming now, sharp and metallic, filling my lungs with every breath. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was the figure from my dream. It was closer now, its blurred edges flickering like static. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, one long, shadowy arm reaching out toward me. Its hand, or what passed for one, was impossibly long, its fingers tapering to points that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. "You opened it," a voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself. "You let it in." The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the room, pressing against my mind like a weight I couldn't escape. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and as I fell to the floor, the last thing I saw was its featureless face tilting down to meet mine. When I woke up, the door was gone. The bathroom was back to normal, as though nothing had happened. But the smell of damp earth still lingered, faint but unmistakable. And when I looked in the mirror, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't moving. It was smiling. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind. It was late, close to midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The air outside was still, the world quiet except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. Then came the sound, a low, hollow whistle, rising and falling in a slow, mournful tune. I sat up, straining to listen. It wasn't coming from outside. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting through the walls like an echo. The apartment next door was empty. I'd known that when I moved in. The landlord mentioned it in passing. The previous tenant had moved out abruptly, leaving the place vacant for months. He said they'd left in a hurry, didn't even bother taking most of their stuff. Still, I convinced myself the sound was nothing. A draft, maybe, or pipes settling. I put in some earplugs and forced myself to sleep. The next night, it came again. The same low whistle, soft and haunting. This time, it lasted longer, weaving a melody that sent shivers down my spine. I got up, pressed my ear to the wall, and listened. The sound stopped. I waited for a moment, then knocked on the wall. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The tune lingered in my mind, looping endlessly like a half-remembered song. The next morning, I asked the landlord about the apartment. "Are you sure no one's living there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Positive," he said. "No one's touched the place since last October." I frowned. What happened to the last tenant? The landlord hesitated. "She moved out," he said, a little too quickly. "Why?" He sighed. "Look, I don't know the details. She left some stuff behind, stopped paying rent. We had to file paperwork to take the unit back. Happens all the time." Something in his tone told me he was lying, but I didn't push it. That night, the whistle came back. This time, it was louder, clearer. It didn't sound like the wind or the pipes anymore. It sounded like someone was standing just on the other side of the wall, their lips pressed to an invisible flute. I couldn't take it. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped into the hallway and made my way to the door of the neighboring apartment. The door was locked. I knocked, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I pressed my ear to the door, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint shuffle, like footsteps retreating into the distance. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The landlord had mentioned the tenant left behind some belongings, so I figured the key might still work. The next morning, while the landlord was distracted, I snuck the spare from the maintenance closet. That evening, I waited until the whistling started again. The tune was different this time, sharper, faster, as though urging me forward. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was cold. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was sparse. An old couch, a coffee table, a lamp leaning at an awkward angle. And then I saw it. A flute, lying on the windowsill. It was old, tarnished, the metal darkened with age. I approached it slowly, the sound of the whistling growing louder with each step. But the strange thing was, the sound wasn't coming from the flute. It was coming from the walls. I leaned closer, and that's when I noticed the scratches. Thin, jagged lines gouged into the plaster, forming shapes that looked almost like symbols. Spirals, triangles, intersecting lines. They were everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. The whistling stopped. The silence was deafening. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, my flashlight beam darting across the shadows. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back to me, her long, dark hair hanging in tangled strands. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't move. I'm sorry to bother you, I stammered. I live next door, and I keep hearing. The woman turned. Her face wasn't right. Her eyes were too wide, the whites stained yellow, and her mouth stretched too far, pulling into a grin that was more teeth than lips. Her voice, when she spoke, was a perfect mimicry of mine. I live next door, she said, tilting her head, and I keep hearing. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. It hit the floor, the beam flickering, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. The symbols began to glow. The whistling returned, louder than ever, a deafening cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The woman, or whatever she was, took a step toward me, her grin widening, her voice overlapping with the whistle. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her words twisting into the melody. I ran. I don't remember how I got out, but the next thing I knew, I was in my own apartment, the door bolted shut behind me. The whistling was still there, faint and distant, but now it felt like it was inside my head. The landlord changed the locks the next day. He didn't ask why I wanted to break my lease, but last night, I heard it again. The whistling. It wasn't coming from next door this time. It was coming from inside my walls. I was making dinner, chopping vegetables while an old playlist hummed through my kitchen speakers. The phone rang, and without looking, I grabbed it from the counter, wiping my hand on a dish towel before answering. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end. Static crackled faintly, distant and rhythmic, like breathing. Who is this? I asked, annoyed. Then a voice came through, low and calm, but eerily familiar. Don't go upstairs. I froze, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering onto the counter. What did you say? You heard me, the voice replied. Stay where you are. Don't go upstairs. My heart was pounding now. The voice sounded like mine, but softer, colder. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, my voice shaking. The line went dead. I set the phone down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a prank, or a wrong number with creepy timing. But as I stood there, staring at the stairs that led to the second floor, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. My house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every shadow. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. You're being ridiculous, I muttered to myself. I took a step toward the stairs. Then I heard it, a soft thud, coming from upstairs. I froze. The sound was faint, like something being dropped onto the carpet. I told myself it was nothing, a stray book falling off a shelf, maybe, but my legs refused to move. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I snatched it up and answered, my voice sharp. Whoever this is, I'm calling the police. Don't, the voice interrupted. It was me again, but this time it sounded closer. The static was gone, replaced by the faint hum of my own kitchen in the background. There's nothing up there for you, it said, almost gently. Stay downstairs. My grip tightened on the phone. Who are you? What do you want? I'm trying to help you, the voice said. Trust me. You don't want to see. The line went dead again. I turned toward the stairs. The unease in my chest had bloomed into full-blown dread, but curiosity was stronger. I grabbed the knife from the counter and started up the steps. The air felt heavier as I climbed, like the house was holding its breath. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before me, lined with doors. All of them were closed, except for one at the far end. My bedroom. The door was ajar, the darkness inside yawning like an open mouth. I took a step forward. The carpet muffled my footsteps, but the house seemed to groan around me, the wooden frame settling in protest. Another step, and then I heard it again, a faint thud coming from the bedroom. My fingers tightened around the knife as I approached the door. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the silence. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Everything was exactly where it should be, bed neatly made, curtains drawn, the faint smell of lavender from the diffuser on the dresser. But there was something wrong, something I couldn't place. Then I saw it, a footprint on the carpet, pressed deep into the fibers, as though someone had been standing there. I looked around wildly, knife raised, but the room was still empty. The footprint didn't match mine. It was larger, the toes longer, almost claw-like. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to answer, but my hand moved on its own, pulling it out and holding it to my ear. "You shouldn't have gone upstairs," the voice said. This time, it wasn't calm. It was trembling, frantic. "What do you mean?" "There's nothing here," I whispered. "Not yet," it said, "but now it knows you're here." The line went dead, and the room around me seemed to shift. The shadows grew darker, deeper, stretching across the walls like ink spilled in water. I ran. I don't remember getting back downstairs. I don't remember locking the door or grabbing my car keys, but I remember driving, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully form. When I finally stopped, I was miles away, parked on the side of an empty road. I checked my phone, desperate for answers, but there was no call history, no record of any incoming or outgoing calls. That was 3 days ago. I haven't been back to the house since, but last night, I got another call. "Come home," the voice said. "We're waiting." And in the background, I heard the faint thud of footsteps coming down the stairs. I never should have agreed to the second date. The first one was fine, normal, even. His name was Andrew, and we met through a dating app. He was polite, charming in an understated way, and we spent a pleasant evening at a wine bar talking about travel and movies. Nothing remarkable, but no red flags either. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car and asked if I'd like to do it again. I said yes because why not? There was no spark, but sometimes those take time. For the second date, Andrew suggested a hike. "There's this great trail about an hour outside the city," he said over text. "Not too crowded. Amazing views." I hesitated. Hiking wasn't exactly my idea of a date, but I'd been trying to be more open to new experiences. "Sure," I replied, and we agreed to meet at the trailhead the following Saturday. When I arrived, Andrew was already there, leaning against his car with a thermos in hand. He smiled when he saw me and offered me a cup of coffee. It was thoughtful, a small gesture that eased some of my reservations. The trail started out easy, winding through a forest dappled with sunlight. Andrew was a good guide, pointing out interesting plants and sharing little bits of trivia about the area. But as we got further in, things started to feel off. The path narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the air seemed heavier somehow, like the forest was watching. "Are we almost to the view?" I asked after about an hour. Andrew stopped and turned to me, his smile slightly too wide. "Almost there. Trust me, it's worth it." That was the first time I felt a prickle of unease. We kept walking, the trail becoming less distinct. At one point, it felt like we were just wandering through the woods, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked. "Positive," he said without hesitation, but his tone was different now. Lighter, almost playful, like he knew something I didn't. Finally, we came to a clearing. It wasn't the breathtaking view he'd promised. It was just a small, flat space surrounded by trees. In the center was a large, moss-covered rock. "This is it?" I asked, trying to mask my disappointment. Andrew didn't respond. I turned to look at him, and my stomach dropped. He was staring at me, his expression unreadable. His easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice faltering. "You don't remember, do you?" he said softly. "Remember what?" He stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away. "This isn't the first time we've been here," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "Not for you. Not for me." My pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Andrew tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "Do you believe in second chances?" I didn't answer. My legs were shaking, and I was acutely aware of how far we were from anyone who could help. "You promised," he continued, his voice low and steady. "You said you'd come back, and now you're here." "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling. "You're scaring me." He smiled then, but it wasn't kind. It was knowing. You don't have to understand, he said, but you do have to finish what you started. He reached into his backpack, and I panicked. Without thinking, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Wait, he called after me, his voice carrying through the trees. You can't leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto a different trail, where I ran into an older couple out for a walk. Help, I gasped, clutching my side. Please, there's a man? But when I turned to point back the way I'd come, the forest was silent. No Andrew, no clearing, just trees. The couple looked at me like I was crazy, but they walked me back to the trailhead and stayed until I got in my car. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to report Andrew to the police, but the name he'd given me wasn't real. His profile on the dating app was gone, and when I checked the trail on a map, I couldn't find the clearing or anything resembling the path we'd taken. For a while, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, but then the dreams started. In them, I'm back in the forest, standing in that clearing. Andrew is there, waiting by the rock. You promised, he says, his voice echoing in my head. And behind him, in the shadows of the trees, there's something else. Something watching. Something waiting. I don't go hiking anymore.